Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku was breaking while everyone expected him to smile? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. A deep sigh escaped Izuku's lips, falling from his mouth with a heaviness he had yet to properly address. His desk was covered in written insults, chewed gum, and what even was that? Izuku decided not to think about it too long and instead just grabbed a cloth from the teacher's supply closet. It was always left unlocked, though he wasn't sure if that was an accident or if the teachers actually felt sympathy for him. Either way, it made his life easier, so he wasn't going to mention it. He glanced at the clock and got to work scrubbing his desk clean. He had 10 minutes before people would start arriving for class, and so he let his mind wander as he pressed the cloth into the desk, surrendering his awareness and allowing his body to move on autopilot. A few weeks ago, he'd had both the best and worst day of his life. The worst because he'd fallen apart and been the one to unintentionally bring harm to Kacchan. The best because he'd finally been told, after all these years, that his dream was within reach. Since then, life had been absolute hell, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. Izuku always knew he'd have to work harder than others. It was a lesson taught to him at only 4 years old, in the cruelest way possible, because life was just like that. Despite the unfairness and mistreatment, however, he persevered. When his heart began to fracture, he taped it back together with delusory dreams and pretty lies. When his lips began twitching downward, he manufactured a smile out of leftover sunlight and sewed it into his skin. And when it all became too much, when hot tears would start leaving cold tracks on his cheeks, he would lock himself in his room at night and paint the pale skin of his forearms red with slick metal, hiding the evidence beneath layers of clothing so no one would worry. He knew it wasn't healthy, but it was the only way he knew how to live, and the only way to keep others from worrying about him. He would be okay as long as no one saw beneath his mask. He couldn't handle it if his suffering started dragging those around him down too. Especially his mother. She didn't deserve that. He was broken out of his thoughts at the sound of a door slamming wide open, which caused Izuku to nearly jump out of his skin. Heavy footsteps thudded their way over to Izuku, and the green-haired boy didn't have to look up to know who it was. "The F are you doing, nerd?" came the low growl of a particular angry blonde. Slowly, Izuku lifted his eyes from the white-knuckled grip he had on the white cloth over his now-clean desk and up to angry red eyes, which were steadily getting angrier. "But are you deaf or just ignoring me, Biggie?" he asked, voice low and gravelly with warning. "No. Of course not, Kacchan. I was just cleaning my desk because it was a little dirty, see, and I guess I was just a bit lost in thought and dash." Izuku started to ramble, his nervousness creeping in and taking control of his vocal cords. Kacchan got even angrier the longer it went on, shoulders tensing and hands clenching into tight fists until finally, "Shut the f up. I don't actually give a shit what you were doing. Just get out of my way, demed nerd." Kacchan bellowed, fists already rising and unfurling to release threatening explosions and an almost comically large scowl on his face. Izuku flinched at the bright sparks dancing in the other's palm, hands flying up and legs backing up on instinct. Kacchan simply scoffed and rolled his eyes at this show of weakness before walking to his desk, brushing Izuku's shoulder harshly with his own on his way. Izuku, thoroughly defeated, simply threw away the soiled cloth and sat down at his desk, mentally preparing himself for the rest of the day. "It'll be okay. You're okay. Just stay positive. Take notes, work out, go home." With a newfound spark of determination flickering to life inside him, Izuku nodded his head, put his game face on, and pulled out his notes, despite the tiredness clawing at the backs of his eyelids. Izuku managed to get out of school with only a few minor bruises, today's bullies having shown some restraint. The day overall, however, had gone about as well as he'd expected it to, his determination holding strong right up until lunch, where he was, once again, humiliated and made to sit by himself on the roof. He tried to get his fire back afterward, but like every other day before, he just couldn't bring that flame to life again. Izuku shook his head, no point in dwelling on that now. He had to meet All Might at the beach so he could train his body. It was honestly much more tiring than he'd originally thought it would be, but he wouldn't give up. He wanted to be a hero more than anything, and if he had to give up some sleep and comfort to do so, then he would. He arrived at the beach park not much later and smiled when he saw All Might. The inordinate amount of exercise was daunting, but being around his idol made him feel safe and comforted, feelings he didn't experience very often otherwise. "Midoriya, my boy," All Might called from atop his perch on a nearby fridge, in his muscle form. Said green-haired boy jogged his way over, admiration already sparkling in his eyes. "All Might," he called back once he was standing in front of him. All Might laughed, spewed blood, and reverted back to his skinnier form, eliciting a yelp from Izuku. It was still a little shocking to see his mentor change in appearance so drastically and suddenly. All Might hopped down from the fridge, already pulling out Izuku's schedule and giving instructions to the smaller male. Izuku did as he was told, bending over to lift and drag heavy objects. It hurt a lot. The muscle fibers were tearing in order to create newer, stronger ones, and it hurt. Izuku's body was weak and beaten, any kind of exercise would hurt, but the strenuous activity he was kept doing felt like it was killing him. He wouldn't complain though. These were the necessary steps to becoming a hero, and he'd be dead if he let something like pain or exhaustion keep him from getting there. With great difficulty, he managed to clear the area All Might had specified by the time the sun was setting. Sweat dripped from his brow, his muscles felt like they were seizing beneath the fabric of his overheated hoodie, and his lungs, he was sure, were about to give out. He collapsed to his knees, breathed heavy and erratic. All Might knelt down next to him. "You did great, young Midoriya. I know it's hard, but you have to stay strong and stick to it, all right? You can do it," he said, temporarily shifting into his muscle form and offering a thumbs up as way of encouragement. Izuku smiled up at him, appreciative of the work and belief All Might was putting into him. It made him feel like he mattered, at least a little. Izuku reached up to run his hand through sweaty curls and his hoodie sleeve drooped slightly, soaked with sweat. The edges of crisp white bandages peeked out from underneath the sleeve, gaining a confused look from All Might, who now was back to normal, and an outstretched hand. Izuku jerked back when he realized the hero was about to pull back his sleeve and slapped on a wobbly smile, feeble lies spilling from his lips in a never-ending torrent until finally All Might simply put his hands up and smiled warmly at the boy. All right, I get it. I won't ask as long as you promise me you're all right, okay kid?" he said, sincerity shining in his eyes and a genuineness in his words you couldn't fake. Izuku smiled warmly back, his body relaxing with relief and his chest swelling with unadulterated admiration for his idol. "Yes, All Might," he agreed, and he didn't feel like he was lying. The cutting, which he knows isn't healthy per se, also isn't really bad for him, right? He's never had to go to the hospital for it or anything like that. It helps him relieve the stress, and as long as he takes care of the cuts afterward, then it's fine, right? It's not fine and he's not fine, but he can't quite admit that to himself, the prospect being far too daunting for him to face. All Might sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, but if you ever need to talk to somebody, I am here," he said, smiling as wide as he can in his current form, sunken eyes crinkling at the corners with the force of it. "Now go home, I'm sure your mother would love to see you," he said, and Izuku did. What Izuku didn't do was tell All Might that his mother would have no clue he was even gone. By the time she got home, Izuku would be fast asleep in bed already. Izuku stood in front of the mirror, eyes roaming over the yellows and purples that decorated his skin. His arms were bare, Izuku having not gotten around to rewrapping them in bandages yet, revealing slowly healing lines of split flesh from his wrists to his forearms. He frowned at himself. He wasn't a pretty picture and he knew it. "It'll get better," he told himself. "You'll get into UA, and people won't beat you up anymore, and you won't have to cut because you'll have friends." The thoughts were almost enough to bring a smile to his face, but as much as he tried to stay optimistic, the devil on his shoulder told him he had to be realistic. He shrugged it off, deciding those were thoughts for future Izuku to deal with. He quickly wrapped his arms and shrugged on his school uniform. He pointedly ignored the emptiness forming in the pit of his stomach. The sky was a brilliant mix of pink, orange, and blue when Izuku stepped outside. The trees swayed in the gentle breeze and ruffled Izuku's hair. He breathed it in greedily, the cool air filling his lungs and doing wonders to soothe his mounting anxieties. He walked to school slowly, wanting to enjoy the peace while he had it. Today was going to be extra hard seeing as Izuku hadn't got the best sleep the night before. He'd made dinner for two and ate alone, sitting in front of the TV so it'd feel a little less lonely. He'd washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. Finally, he'd taken a cold shower and collapsed into bed. But despite how his tummy was full, despite how his hair was clean and dry, despite how his muscles cried for it, sleep wouldn't come. He'd eventually awoken groggy and restless. Now, as he stared at the daunting silhouette of his middle school building, the heaviness in his limbs felt like a death sentence. The feeling was further cemented when Kacchan tripped him at the school gate. He fell to the ground with a grunt as Kacchan's goons laughed and pointed. Kacchan didn't say anything, just smirked and scoffed as he walked away. Izuku watched him go, a sigh falling from his lips. Well, he could already tell how this day was going to go. Katsuki walked into the school, adjusting the weight of his backpack strap on his shoulder. He was still irritated, but he felt better after making that nerd eat dirt. He knew, deep down, that Deku hadn't really done anything to warrant it, but he couldn't help himself. Couldn't admit those truths to himself. Every time he looked at Deku, he saw someone with a strong, kind, heroic spirit, and it made Katsuki so damn mad. Katsuki had all the skill, all the bravery, the quirk, and yet that BS dirty was always acting like the hero. In the same way Katsuki had everything Deku didn't, Deku had the things Katsuki couldn't. He knew that. And the jealousy was unbearable, as was the strange tingle in his belly and clenching in his chest when the other was around, so he covered it up with anger and imaginary condescension. He deserved it. Katsuki told himself. He has no right acting like he can do something when he's powerless. It's insulting. Katsuki could feel his temper rising again. His blood simmered dangerously close to its boiling point, but the blonde pushed it back down, willing himself to calm down. He was so caught up in trying to rein in his temper that he didn't even realize he'd walked all the way to his homeroom class door, leaving his goons behind somewhere in the process. Katsuki, not one to turn around for anybody, simply opened the door and walked inside. The class was empty, nobody having gotten there yet. There was still 5 minutes before the first bell rung, after all. As he made his way to his desk, he caught sight of Deku's desk and stopped in his tracks. Insults and threats were scrawled all over his desk, along with chewed gum, spit, and whatever that was. It was disgusting. Was this why the nerd was always cleaning his desk in the morning? Katsuki hadn't known about this. He'd never been early enough to see it. The insults were horrible too. Nothing really worse than what he himself had said before, but somehow seeing the words written in others' handwriting twisted his gut and made his blood begin to heat in a familiar way. His desk was covered with things like, "You're useless," "Burden," "Nobody wants you here," "Talentless," "Worthless nobody," "Stupid," "Kill yourself." Katsuki found himself staring at the desk far longer than he ever intended to, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The smell of smoke rising from his curled palms was what ultimately broke him out of his weird trance, and Katsuki turned and hurried back to his desk before anyone could come in and see him staring at the stupid nerd's desk. His temper was skyrocketing again, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure out why. Why did he care what those extras did to Deku? Katsuki did things like that to him too. So why did this feel so different? Thankfully, he didn't have to ruminate on it for long because in less than a minute the bell rang and students began filing in. Usually Deku was the first one in class so he could clean his desk, but today he barely made it in the class in time. Katsuki refused to ask himself why. Some extras were muffling laughter at the mess Deku was now facing. Others walked by and added to it. The teacher came in and saw what was happening, but he didn't say anything. Whether it was because he genuinely didn't care or didn't have enough ball to stand up to a bunch of middle schoolers, Katsuki genuinely couldn't tell. Either way, the guy was an a-hole. Not that Katsuki gave a shit. Deku cleaned his desk as quickly as he could, a look of distress and fatigue painting his features. The blonde barely spared it a glance, though, as looking at the nerd's face had his stomach twisting and his blood boiling all over again. It irritated him. The rest of class went by rather uneventfully. The blonde took notes silently and went about his work as normal. Near the end of class, however, their teacher began droning on about a subject Katsuki was already very familiar with. He leaned back in his seat and kicked his feet up on his desk, content to ride out the rest of the class with a quick nap. He glanced around the room as he put his arms above his head and caught sight of Deku with his face down and buried in his arms. What caught his attention, however, was the way the nerd's nails dug into his uniform sleeves. The grip was hard enough to turn his knuckles white. There was no way that didn't hurt. Katsuki felt a lump begin to take form in his throat, but he swallowed it down just as quickly. He clicked his tongue, averting his red eyes and closing them. Not his problem. Except it felt like it was. Izuku got home just as the sun was beginning to set. He stepped into the living room and heaved a sigh of relief. Despite the disarray of the apartment, neither Izuku nor Inko really has the time to clean. After all, he felt comforted. Today had been particularly hard. He'd gotten hardly any sleep the night before, was stopped by bullies on his way to class, so he had to clean his desk in front of everyone. Training had been gruesome. He sighed again, though this one was heavy for a different reason. He made his way over to the couch, planning on watching some TV in an attempt to relax before getting ready for bed. As he sat down on the couch, he noticed some letters scattered across the surface of the coffee table. He picked one up gently and flipped it around in his hands. It looked like it had already been opened. He took the paper out and began reading it. It was a bill, past due. He felt his fingers crinkling the paper slightly and put it back, grabbing for another. Past due, past due, past due. Izuku could feel himself trembling. His mother was sobbing. She was on her knees, clutching papers in her hands, and dripping salty tears on the floor like an overflowing river. He could see her shoulders shaking with the force of the choking sobs clawing their way out of her throat and felt his own heart clench in response. He didn't understand what was happening. The memory assaulted him, swarming his vision and ringing in his ears. "Mommy? Why are you crying?" he asked, his own voice coming out shaky. The green-haired woman turned around at the sound of his fearful voice, her own eyes full of worry and overwhelming despair. "Oh, Izuku," she choked out finally, scooping her son into her arms and holding him tightly. Izuku, confused and afraid, clutched her shirt tightly, feeling his own tears beginning to swell in his eyes. Izuku could feel his eyes beginning to burn. "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I don't know what we're going to do," she whispered, words not really meant to be heard but heard nonetheless. Izuku glanced down to the papers now discarded on the floor. The fine print was too small to read from his vantage point, but the word eviction was too big to miss. Izuku, however, as a 4-year-old boy, had no idea what that word meant. All he knew was that the big red letters that made his mother cry scared him, and so he clung to his mother's shirt just a little tighter. Izuku struggled to get his breathing under control. He didn't want to have another panic attack, especially not right now when he was so tired already. So he dug his nails into his arms and ignored the guilt clawing its way up his esophagus. The pain stemming from his arms began spreading through him like a wildfire as he pressed harder, leaving emptiness and relief in its wake. Slowly, Izuku felt himself calming, and he loosened his grip on his arms. His breathing was normal again and his fear had settled, but the guilt was still there, eating away at him. They'd always had money problems, ever since. Izuku huffed and stood on shaky legs. And when Inko got home that night, the house was clean and her bed was already made. The sound of the TV sounded from the living room, muffled by the walls of the kitchen. He could hear his mother moving around in there, frantically searching for her purse while tying her hair up because she'd woken up late again. It was like this almost every day, and it was heartbreaking to watch. She worked herself so hard. Ignoring the fresh wave of guilt the thought brought in, Izuku finished tying up the lunch he'd just made and rushed it out to his mother just as she was heading out the door. Mom, wait." At the sound of her son's voice, Inko turned, hand paused on the doorknob. Her hair was messy and the skin under her eyes was growing increasingly dark with lack of sleep, but at the sight of her son with a bento box in his hands meant for her, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine and true. Izuku smiled back at her and handed her the box, the cloth slipping from his fingers to hers. "Thank you, Izu. Be safe at school, okay?" she said, all soft and encouraging. Izuku nodded. "I'll try." And he was telling the truth. He always tried to avoid trouble. It wasn't his fault, it always came looking for him. Unaware and satisfied with his answer, however, Inko simply ruffled his hair, turned around, and let the door shut softly. Behind her, at the sound of her footsteps receding down the hallway, Izuku let his shoulders slump. Uff, he groaned into the emptiness of his living room. He took a moment to let himself relax for once, let himself feel the ache in his muscles from overworking himself, the throbbing in his temple from too many hours staring at textbooks, the heaviness pulling at his eyelids from inadequate sleep, to just let everything sink in for a moment. He stayed there for a long minute, pulling air into his lungs and filtering it out in a steady rhythm. Finally, though, he was forced to pull himself to his feet and get started on his morning routine, lest he fall too deeply into some spiral of thought that he couldn't pull himself out from. The words on Izuku's school notebook were starting to blur. Letters and symbols formed from black ink were beginning to resemble black smudges on the white paper, becoming incoherent and making it frustrating to look at. Izuku threaded thin fingers through messy curls, gripping and tugging in an attempt to gain some focus back. It worked, but only temporarily. He tuned back into what his teacher was saying and transcribed it into his notes dutifully, but it wasn't 10 minutes before his brain seemed to switch off once again and his vision grew fuzzy. He sighed in frustration and dropped his pen so he could grasp at green strands yet another time. Why was this happening? He wasn't sick, he'd had a decent night's rest, he'd eaten a good breakfast, everything was normal, so why? Why was it that every time he tried to focus on the sounds flitting around him and the characters on the chalkboard his concentration began fizzling out? Why was paying attention causing him to feel so fatigued? It took a few minutes, but eventually the ache in his temples subsided and the world around him settled into clarity once again. As he released his hair and looked up, he realized there was a woman standing at the front of the room that hadn't been there before. She was short with long curly brown hair tied neatly into a low bun. Her eyes were a light gray, an odd but pretty contrast to the rest of her fairly normal appearance. A light blue scrub top was tucked into form-fitting dress pants and a clipboard hung from between her hands. She was also speaking, Izuku belatedly realized. Sently hired as the new school nurse. But I won't just be putting band-aids on your scratches. I'm also assuming the role of the school counselor, so you can come to me for both physical and mental ailments, she said, a bright smile on her face. She seemed excited and happy to be there, and it made Izuku feel instantly comfortable around her. One of the kids next to him raised their hand and asked, "I'm sorry, miss, but what do we call you?" The lady's face flushed pink and she brought a hand up to cover it. I'm so sorry. I forgot to say my name. I am Fukami Jasudo, but you can just call me Fukami. We can call you by your first name? Isn't that a bit informal?" The student from earlier piped up once again. "Yes, it is a bit informal, but if I'm going to be spending a lot of time around you all, then I'd like for us to act more friendly towards each other. Don't you agree?" That bright, charming smile was back, creasing the corners of her eyes. A loud scoff rang out from Kacchan's seat. Then, and Izuku felt dread settle in his chest at the thought of the rude blonde giving this kind lady an earful. Turned out he had every reason to feel so apprehensive. "I don't really give a shit, lady. Are you done yapping yet? 'Cause I came here to learn, and that's what I plan to do," Kacchan said, ferocious scowl and glare in place. Izuku looked back at Fukami, readying himself to stand up and apologize for the rude blonde at the look of shock on her face. Before he could, however, that look of shock melted into one of mirth and understanding. I see. You have a bit of an inferiority complex, don't you?" Kacchan's face practically burst into flames, the redness smothering his cheeks and reaching to the tips of his ears. The sight shocked the class, including Izuku, so much so that nobody said anything for a solid minute. Izuku gaped openly at Kacchan, even when the boy glanced back at him. He saw Kacchan bristle the moment their eyes made contact and tried to feign nonchalance, But Kacchan was already turning back to Fukami, smoke rising steadily from the cracks between his clenched fingers. What the F did you just say to me, hag? And whatever spell the class had been under was suddenly lifted. As was the spell on their homeroom teacher, who'd seemingly finally heard enough out of his favorite student. Alright, Katsuki, calm down. She meant no offense. Right, Ms. Jasuto? Fukami, please. And yes, I didn't mean to upset you, honest. I get a little carried away sometimes, she laughed slightly, raising a hand to rub at the back of her neck. Kacchan seemed to settle down slightly at her words, leaning back in his chair with nothing but a tee. Fukami then nodded and turned to face the rest of the class. Alright, well, to finish off what I was saying earlier, my office is just down the hallway. It's the last door on the right. Please, come see me if you need anything. Anything at all. She bowed. The class murmured their assent as she stood up straight once again and left the classroom with a small wave goodbye. Everything was silent for a moment before their teacher stood and resumed their lesson. She seems nice, Izuku thought. Maybe I should talk to her? No, there's no need for me to waste that sweet woman's time. I'm sure there are lots of other people lining up to speak with her already. I can handle everything myself. I'll be fine. Inferiority complex? Katsuki thought as he made his way over to his usual lunch table. His eyes instinctively scoped the room for green curls, but he didn't find any. He knew he wouldn't. Deku was chased from the lunchroom every day. Where the nerd ate, Katsuki had no idea, nor did he care. At least he shouldn't care. Extra number 1, as Katsuki liked to call him, greeted him with stretched fingers as he sat down. Extra number 2 simply nodded at him, which was fine with Katsuki. He hated when people tried to be overly friendly with him. You totally went off on the new nurse, Katsuki. She really made you mad, huh? Extra number 1 asked. Huh? What kind of question is that? Obviously she made me angry. Talkin' like she knows me, what a load of crap. He replied, glaring down viciously at his lunch tray. Thinking about her was getting him riled up. Yeah, but she's still an adult. You probably shouldn't talk to her that way. Extra number 2 decided to speak up and only succeeded in making Katsuki angrier. He didn't need a lecture from these losers. I don't give a shit. Adult or not, she's still just an extra who needs to get out of my way. Katsuki stabbed his chopsticks into his food with enough force to snap said chopsticks in half, and the two others decided that was probably as far as they were gonna get with that line of conversation. Yeah. So, anyway, I was thinking I might talk to her. I need some help figuring out which high school I'm gonna go to. What about you? Extra number 1 turned and asked extra number 2, effectively starting a new discussion and leaving Katsuki to eat his meal in peace. Though, unbeknownst to them, Katsuki was not currently eating in peace at all, despite the indifferent look on his face as he shoveled food into his mouth with broken chopsticks. Instead, he couldn't stop remembering the embarrassing eye contact he'd made with Deku. God, he'd never live it down. He knew he'd been blushing, the intense burning of his skin a dead giveaway even if he was stupid enough to overlook the shocked faces of the classroom extras, which he wasn't. And of course, he just had to make direct eye contact with stupid, shitty Deku while he was in the middle of blushing like a maniac. The nerd's eyes were wide as saucers, his mouth agape, and his cheeks tinted their own brand of cherry red. He wasn't sure why Deku had been blushing. It wasn't a mortifying experience for him. All he knew was that the sight was entirely too much, for whatever reason, and he had to look away immediately. It had made him uncomfortable, to say the least, and just made the entire experience all the more awful. He was insanely relieved when she'd finally left. Katsuki thought, then, that he'd probably rather eat rocks than talk to her again. Izuku shut the door behind him as softly as he could, not wanting to disturb his mother. He was greeted by darkness, all lights having been turned off except for a single lamp still on beside the coffee table. He could see his mother's purse there, a neatly folded note with his name on it propped up on the side of the handbag. Approaching the table quietly, he unfurled the note and let his eyes scan the page. Izuku, I saw your text about running late tonight, so I made some dinner for you. It's your favorite, katsudon. It's in the fridge, just heat it up in the microwave. Try to get a good night's sleep, alright? Good night, Izuku. Izuku smiled softly at the note, warmth and adoration swelling in his chest. He loved his mother so much, she was such an amazing, kind woman. It was like torture, growing up and watching that same delightful, loving woman pass out on the couch after long days at work, watching her hide the overdue bills and bank statements in books and behind furniture, watching her give everything she had just to keep a roof over their head and food in the cabinets. Just to take care of him. But at that moment, staring at the small, sweet note cradled in his hands, he felt the weight of his guilt reducing back to a small rock, backed into some small corner nestled deep in his chest. It wasn't the crushing boulder it had been before. After all, he wasn't just watching her work herself to the bone anymore. He was going to share the workload, support her, help put her back together. He was doing something about it, now. He had just gotten a job for her. Izuku's legs were killing him. So were his arms. Actually, just about everything was killing him, he decided as he lugged another half of a car across the beach. His muscles cried out in retaliation and he grit his teeth to keep pushing forward. All Might cheered him on in the background, pumping his fist and shouting encouraging words at him. It was enough to get one final tug out of Izuku, successfully getting the car to where it needed to be, but not enough to keep the exhausted boy upright afterward. He collapsed to his hands and knees, shaking as he gasped for breath. All Might was next to him in a second, towering over him in his buff form, and patting his back with a bit too much force while offering praise. "You're doing so well, young Midoriya. You'll make a fine successor indeed." The man offered him a thumbs up and Izuku gave a wobbly smile in return. "But I have to ask, young Midoriya?" All Might shrunk back down to his emaciated form in a puff of smoke, his smile faltering a little and his eyebrows pinching together. This earned a look of confusion and concern from Izuku, who was just beginning to breathe normally again. "Are you sure you're all right, my boy? You're getting dark circles under your eyes and you're getting more exhausted during training than you should. Perhaps the regimen I created for you was too intense for your body?" Izuku felt a momentary panic squeeze his heart at his mentor's words. If All Might found out about the job he'd gotten at the local convenience store, he'd get worried and likely cut back on Izuku's schedule. He couldn't let that happen. How was he supposed to become a hero if he didn't keep working hard? "And oh, I'm fine, I promise." He rushed to assure the older man, hands coming up and waving wildly as if to physically disperse those thoughts. At All Might's doubtful look, Izuku added, "Really? I'm fine. I have a little trouble sleeping sometimes, but it's nothing to worry about, honest," he said, not telling the full truth, but not lying either. "I can do this," Izuku said, forest green eyes filling with a quiet determination as he looked up to gaze into his instructor's eyes. All Might studied him carefully. They sat there in silence for a long minute, All Might seeming to ruminate heavily on Izuku's words, before the man finally sighed and let his shoulders drop. "All right if you're sure. Just make sure to tell me if there's something more going on, all right? You're the future #1 hero, after all. I have to make sure you're healthy and happy." The skeletal man put a large hand on Izuku's shoulder and offered him a kind smile to which Izuku returned with his own. "Thank you, All Might." All Might nodded, and Izuku went to stand up on shaky legs. His muscles still burned from overworking them, but at least he could use them now. He walked over to where All Might was previously sat and picked up a water bottle half buried in the sand. He opened it and took long gulps, leaning against the side of an old refrigerator. It had been a long day and he was so very tired. He had to devote so much energy just to staying focused in class. It was difficult to keep grades good, to keep training his body so religiously, to keep attending work every other night at the expense of adequate sleep, all while putting up with school bullies, the pressure of one day bearing one for all, and the mysterious rain cloud that seemed to loom over him constantly. It was a lot. But he'd been doing it, was doing it, could do it. Which meant as soon as he put down his water bottle, he was pulling out his phone and telling his mother he'd be late again tonight. She still didn't know he had a job. He'd been waiting to get his first paycheck to tell her. "Who are you texting, my boy?" All Might asked, coming over to stand across from him. Just my mom," he replied as he put his phone away, tucking it away safely in his back pocket. "Your mother? I believe you mentioned her once before." Inko, correct. Why yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised you remember. All Might smiled somewhat sheepishly and brought a hand up to scratch at the back of his neck. Yes, well, you talked about her so fondly, I couldn't help but commit the name to memory. She seems like a sweet woman. Izuku smiled brightly up at his mentor. It made him feel happy and warm to hear the other man using such kind words when referring to his mother. She really is, he said, eyes glazing over for a fraction of a second as memories flashed behind his eyes like a rapidly spinning roll of film. Luckily, All Might didn't seem to notice, as in the next moment, he was leaning down and gathering his things. Izuku did the same, and soon, they were back at the beach entrance. You did well today, young Midoriya. Keep it up. The man said, smile wide on his gaunt face. Izuku offered a bright smile of his own in return, but once All Might was turned around and walking away, he let it drop. He wanted to smile, he always did, but the effort required to make himself do it just didn't seem worth it when he was alone. Sighing, he began his journey toward the store he worked at only 1 block over. It had been 2 weeks since he got his job, and while it wasn't a particularly hard job, it was quickly becoming exhausting to the point he was having a hard time getting himself to go. He would debate with himself after training every time he'd have a shift scheduled. Did he really need to go? Would it really hurt all that much if he missed just 1 shift? Ultimately, distant visions of missed dinners and the pink shards of porcelain piggy banks always won out, pushing him through the clear, sliding doors and towards his station every time. And so he went, spending the rest of his daylight hours standing behind a register and ringing up old ladies' scratch cards. But despite how the job drained him, filled him with anxiety and robbed him of sleep, if you were to ask, he'd say he was glad he'd gotten the job. He got paid for the first time that night when his shift finally ended. As he stepped into the darkness of his silent living room, Izuku caught sight of another neatly folded note out of the corner of his eye. It sat on the coffee table in the same spot the last one had, his name written in loopy letters on the front. Izuku made his way over to it, picking it up and unfolding it. Izuku, you've been getting home late every other day for the past couple weeks. I didn't ask because I trust you and wanted to give you room to make your own decisions. However, I'm beginning to get a bit concerned. If there's something going on, you know you can tell me, right? I'm your mother. I will love you and be there for you no matter what. So please, don't feel afraid to talk to me. A fond grin pulled at Izuku's lips as he studied the note. He really was lucky to have someone like his mom in his life. He folded the note back up carefully and tucked it into his pants pocket for safekeeping. Instead of writing a note in reply like he did last time, though, he simply pulled out his wallet and put the money he'd made on the coffee table where the note had previously sat. It would be enough to cover the house payment that month, at least. But he felt heavy still. Shouldn't he feel lighter? He'd thought that he'd feel better once he was finally able to give back to his mother, and he was happy about that, but it didn't alleviate the pressure on him like he thought it would. It felt like he was being slowly crushed and nothing was helping. It was starting to feel like nothing would help. Nothing but... Izuku slid his wallet back in his pocket and made his way toward the bathroom. He opened the drawers beneath the sink and reached inside, fingers searching until finally he pulled a small black box out from behind a pipe. The box felt like lead in his hands despite the way a small amount of relief flooded his veins at the sight. He made his way to his room, the weight of his burdens pulling him down like an increase in gravity and filling his head with deafening static. Stumbling into his room, he fumbled for the light switch and pulled a first aid kit out from under his bed. He kept one in his room at all times. His mother thought he was just being safe. He wondered, briefly, what she would think if she found out what it was actually used for. The thought curled in his gut like spoiled milk, but the overwhelming flood of mind-numbing emotion kept his limbs moving. He sat on his bed and slowly lifted the lid off the black box, revealing thin, shiny pieces of metal. He stripped off his shirt gently, the fabric brushing against bruises and scars and sending waves of dull pain rippling across his skin. The flesh on his forearms was raised with small bumps, reminders of many nights spent exactly like this one. Sitting in his room with nothing but the whispers of dark thoughts and darker memories to keep him company. How'd it come to this? He used to think. Now, clutched in the jaws of a hopelessness too much for him, all he could think was I need it, I need this release, I just want to feel okay. And so he grasped cold metal between his fingers and lifted it from the box, pushing the razor blade into the soft skin of his forearm gently and watching the thin red stripe appear in its wake. The pain was sharp but small, like a bee sting. He pressed a little harder next time, watching as the blood brimmed and spilled, dripping down his arm in a thin strain. The pain was hotter, searing, it pulsed through him and pierced through the fog in his head slowly. Metal pressed into soft flesh a few more times, the pain increasing with every new mark until eventually, finally, he could think clearly again. He looked down at his arms, now streaked with the cooling wine red of his own blood, and felt guilt settle heavily in his gut. He shouldn't be doing this. He knows he shouldn't. But I need it. He shook his head at the intrusive thought. No, you don't, you're okay, you'll be okay. You can get through this without resorting to this every time. He pointed out to himself, but the words felt hollow. But I can't. It's just every once in a while when things get to be too much. I can have this one thing, can't I? Izuku sighed. He knew it wasn't healthy and that he really shouldn't be doing it, but despite the guilt that came with that knowledge, he felt like he didn't have enough strength to make himself stop. Didn't really want to make himself stop. So instead of trying to argue with his inner voice anymore, he opened the first aid kit and began to dress his wounds. Slowly, the red staining his skin was wiped away and the sight of marred flesh was covered with pristine, white bandages. Once his arms were cleaned and bandaged, he slid the kit under his bed and tucked the razor back into its box. He then sat the razor on his bedside table, too tired to put it back in its place in the bathroom. I'll just put it back in the morning, he told himself. Finally, the green-haired boy turned off the light and laid down in bed, exhaustion already pulling his eyelids shut as he tugged the blanket up around his shoulders. Sleep came faster than usual that night, but his slumber was fitful, dreams of a tall man with dark hair and freckles haunting him. So I snuck out last night, Extra number 2 proclaimed, a satisfied smile curling his lips. His uniform was askew, one side untucked from his pants and dangling. His bag was thrown over one shoulder and he walked with long strides. It was so obvious he was trying to copy Katsuki and look like a bad boy, it was almost funny. Almost. Extra number 1 snorted at the smug look and raised an eyebrow, a hint of incredulity in his voice when he replied. Seriously? My parents didn't wake up at all. It was a total success. Man, you've got to teach me how you do it. I always get caught. I can't teach you how not to be an idiot. Hey! Katsuki stomped into the ground with force, hoping the dull thuds would drown out the mindless, stupid chatter coming from the 2 idiots behind him. They'd been talking constantly since the moment they'd all met up to walk to school together. Their annoying voices were like nails on a chalkboard this early in the morning. Unfortunately for him, the stomping didn't work and he was stuck listening to it the entire way to class. Irritation swelled in his gut and curled his fingers, and yet he said nothing. Instead, he simply stomped harder, willing the tingle in his hands to subside and the urge to blow some extra's face off to die down. Normally, he would just scream at them to shut the hell up, but he was determined not to lose his cool today. And so he walked through the halls, passing by the walls of lockers and useless anti-bullying posters, without saying a word. Even when the extras laughed obnoxiously loud and called, "Katsuki! You gotta hear this," over some moronic classroom drama. Even when some girl pretended to accidentally drop her things in front of the blonde in hopes he'd offer his time and effort in order to help her. Like he'd do that for anyone, let alone some FANG extra. Despite all that, though, despite how everyone seemingly converged on him like he was blood in the water the moment he didn't automatically snap at them, he kept his mouth pressed into a firm, thin line. After all, today he had an objective, and he needed to stay focused on it. Bakugos Katsuki did not fail at anything, so if practicing patience was a necessary step in obtaining victory, he would. At least for a little while. Deku was zoning out again. His eyes bored into the board in front of them, but they weren't focused. His pupils weren't tracing the white letters or closely inspecting the texture of the slate stone. No, he wasn't really looking at anything. It had taken the blonde a few times of looking back and seeing the nerd staring holes in various places to figure out he was just getting lost in thought. He'd been confused at first, wondering what could possibly be so interesting about the back of that girl's head or the slightly overflowing trash can in the corner. He was still confused, honestly, but for a different reason. Now, he found himself pondering why he was spacing out at all. What was more important than paying attention in class? Didn't he want to be a hero? Quirk or not, there was no way he'd get into a good school if he didn't study properly. Not that he really cared. Katsuki shook his head and huffed, eyes trailing over Deku's still, freckled face. There were slight bags under his unseeing green eyes and his lips drooped down in a relaxed frown. When the nerd finally snapped out of it, his face settled into a look of determination and he immediately dove back into his notes, peeking at others' notebooks and scribbling down furiously what he'd missed in an attempt to catch up. His fingers started to tremble as he did so, a clear sign of fatigue. Deku was noticeably exhausted both mentally and physically. And Katsuki had no idea why. But he planned on finding out. The blonde turned back around in his seat and began concentrating on the lesson once again, transcribing words onto the blank page of his homeroom notebook until the bell finally rang. Katsuki cornered Deku the moment he stepped out of the classroom. He was always the last one out, staring at his phone until all of his peers and bullies were well on their way. It was annoying to have to wait so long, but it did give them more privacy, so he kept himself from complaining about it as he grabbed the shorter boy's uniform sleeve and began dragging him away. What are you doing, Kacchan? Deku questioned. He sounded worried, his voice high-pitched and tinged with fear, which, admittedly, was understandable. But the sound still grated on Katsuki's nerves. Shut the nerd. I can do whatever the hell I want. Deku's face contorted at that. He looked constipated almost, like there was something he wanted to say, but he held himself back. Probably a good idea. They made their way through the halls, silent except for the murmur of distant chatter and the sound of shoes hitting carpet. Deku didn't try to resist, but Katsuki could see him slowly shrinking in on himself the farther they traveled. For some reason, the sight really bothered the blonde. It inspired emotions he wasn't sure what to do with or what to think about. He hated having to do any sort of introspection. It made him uncomfortable for reasons he also wasn't ready to address. So he didn't do it. Instead, he simply labeled the emotions anger and tightened his grip on the other's uniform sleeve, earning a small squeak in response. Finally, they rounded the corner and Katsuki led Deku into the boys' bathroom. The green-haired boy was clearly confused. He looked around in bewilderment and mumbled to himself a mile a minute. Katsuki rolled his eyes at the sight and flicked his forehead to get his attention. It worked, Deku's big green eyes blinking and moving to train on him in an instant. I didn't bring you here to give you a swirly nuts, he said, having overheard one of Deku's mumblings. Said boy's cheeks lit up at the comment and Katsuki smirked. What are we in here for? I don't have a lot of time, so dash. That's exactly why we're in here, Deku. Why the don't you have time? Why are you so tired all the time? It's effing weird and I want to know what's going on with you. The blonde demanded, crossing his arms over his chest and fixing the other with a hard glare. Deku stared at Katsuki's crimson eyes with nothing but confusion. What do you care? He asked sincerely. Green curls fell into Deku's eyes as he pet his head to the side. Who the F said I care, huh? I'm just curious, I hope. Besides, if you're doing some secret training or something, I deserve to know. Deserve? Deku asked in disbelief, his hands clenching slightly at his sides. Apparently, Katsuki had hit a nerve. What makes you think you deserve to know anything about me? Deku was obviously trying to sound angry, but he sounded more sad than anything, his words wavering and cracking too much. It was all foreign to Katsuki, who was used only to the words of strong resolve and endless optimism. He was used to looking into eyes that sparkled like starlight. That was all still there, still an inseparable part of the other boy, but it was buried under this veil of something, at least temporarily. It shocked Katsuki enough to knock him into silence for a few moments, but the peace didn't last long. It took little time for the blonde to get his bearings, and once he did, he was furious. You don't get to talk back to me like that, nerd. If you don't have the strength to back up your words, then don't say shit. If you want to fight back, then do it. He yelled, eyes wide, scowl menacing, and palms already crackling. Deku backed away from him, his big eyes already filling with tears. Why are you so mean? Then Deku was turning around and running out of the bathroom as fast as those legs of his would take him. Katsuki stared at the spot the other boy had just vacated, the anger within him reaching its peak as he realized he hadn't actually gotten an answer from him. He'd failed. F-. He screamed, turning around and slamming his fist into the wall. Izuku's head hit the counter with a dull thud. It was quiet in the store, the previous customer having left the store empty after she'd finished buying her tampons and dark chocolate bars. He was completely drained. He felt as if his internal battery was completely and utterly dead, entirely void of power. Only he couldn't just lie down and read a book to let his battery recharge. He was stuck working on overdrive constantly. He tilted his head to the side, glancing up at the clock warily. 7 o'clock. He groaned long and low. He'd only been working 30 minutes. It felt like so much longer than that. I'm so tired. I can't wait to go home. I can eat some nice, hot katsudon and lay down in my warm, comfy bed. Yeah, that sounds like heaven. Izuku smiled slightly, allowing the daydreams to comfort him. Only a couple more hours and I'll be in heaven. A chime broke him from his thoughts, the sound telling him he wasn't alone. Izuku looked up, a bright smile already in place and a hand poised in the air, ready to greet the new customer with as much enthusiasm as he could muster. Then he saw those unmistakable blonde spikes and crimson eyes and his heart turned to lead in his chest. You don't get to talk back to me like that, nerd. If you don't have the strength to back up your words, then don't say shit. If you want to fight back, then do it. He'd screamed, his face contorting in his fury and the sweat on his palms roaring to life. The sight sent shocks of fear shooting up his spine, a feeling he was already quite accustomed to. It was so unfair. He'd hardly said anything to him and yet it ended up like this. If he wasn't so quick to anger, maybe they could have a real conversation. Maybe he could actually listen to Izuku's words. Maybe Izuku's life would be a little easier. But he didn't. And it wasn't. So Izuku ran. The memory only added to the dread pooling in his stomach. Just his luck. Kacchan and his goons, who'd walked in behind the blonde, made their way through the aisles without so much as a glance his way. Apparently, they hadn't noticed Izuku yet, something that the green-haired boy was immensely grateful for. Maybe he could find a fake mustache real quick and don a disguise before they checked out, or hide behind the desk and pretend he was a midget, or, "Oi, how much do these Kacchan's voice rung out before cutting off abruptly. Izuku froze. He stayed there for a minute, staring at the counter like it held the secrets of the universe. Then, breathing in deeply, slowly, he raised his head stiffly and made eye contact with wide red orbs. Kacchan was standing just as motionless as Izuku had been, a bag of spicy chips in hand. His goons had joined the blonde's side as soon as they'd heard him cut off, curious as to what could possibly elicit that kind of reaction from the volatile boy. They stared at Izuku as well, all their faces a mix of confusion, surprise, and incredulity. For a tense second that felt like it lasted an eon, everything was silent and everything was still. And then Kacchan's goons burst into laughter. Oh my god, the useless idiot works at a convenience store? How pathetic can you get? Izuku hung his head in shame at the comments, his cheeks already heating up with the feelings of insecurity. He grasped his biceps, sinking in on himself in an attempt to hide from the critical eyes and find some kind of comfort. Kacchan was silent as his goons laughed. His arm dropped and he ducked his head so his expression couldn't be read, the action inspiring uneasiness in Izuku. The uneasiness turned quickly into alarm and then into resignation as Kacchan began stomping his way over to the counter. Not again, he groaned tiredly, softly, not thinking the other would hear. Not again. Maybe he could just change his name and move to another country. Kacchan slammed his hand down on the counter in front of Izuku, but to the other's surprise, Izuku didn't yelp or startle at all. He was too tired, not that Kacchan knew that. How the hell did a useless nerd like you get a effing job, huh? Kacchan asked, vermilion irises ablaze with wrath, and for the life of him, Izuku could not understand why. What did he do to make the blonde so vengeful? How did he offend him this time? Why did you even get one? Is this why you're so FING tired all the DMN time? You think making a few extra bucks is more important than your education? With every question, Kacchan grew louder and louder. His goons had long since stopped laughing and were glancing at each other in bewilderment. It looked like Izuku wasn't the only one wondering why the blonde was so angry. Izuku, severely sleep-deprived and with poor self-preservation instincts, didn't think to reply as he let his mind wander. He zoned out, staring straight at the blonde as he contemplated the other's temper. Kacchan, evidently, did not appreciate being ignored. He growled and shot an arm out, grasping Izuku's forearm and shouting at him to get his attention. As the taller boy's fingers dug into the shoulders, Izuku was reminded of what he had done just the night before. He flinched hard, trying to rip his arm from Katsuki's grasp, and hissed through his teeth as pain raced up his arm. Stunned at the violent reaction, Kacchan let go, staring at Izuku dumbfounded. The blonde's goons seemed to find it funny, bursting out into laughter once again, but Kacchan simply narrowed his eyes suspiciously at Izuku as he rubbed his arm tenderly. Much to the green-haired boy's relief, though, he didn't say a word. He simply huffed and turned on his heel, heading straight for the door. "Hey, Katsuki, where are you going? Yeah man, didn't you want chips?" His goons called after him, their voices becoming softer and more distant as they chased after the blonde. Izuku buried his face in his hands, taking a moment to just breathe. After a minute or two, when his heart no longer felt like it was beating out of his chest, he chanced another glance at the clock. 7:28. And if Izuku whimpered pathetically, draping himself over the counter, no one would know. But wait! A woman called, halting Katsuki in his steps. He'd been angrily storming down the hall after that infuriating conversation in the bathroom. He figured the lady was probably just gonna tell him to keep quiet and turned around to give her some half-butted apology that made it clear he didn't really give a shit. Upon turning around, he recognized her as the new school therapist. What was her name again? Fumi? Famiki? Whatever, it didn't really matter. Katsuki, right? She asked. Yeah, why? Got something else to say to me, lady? She simply smiled at him despite the harsh tone and challenging words. It annoyed the blonde. My name isn't lady. It's Fukami. Though I know you don't care. Katsuki clicked his tongue, the little patience he had already wearing thin. Yeah, get on with it. You've got something to say to me, don't you? I don't think you stopped me just to remind me what your name was. Fukami chuckled lightly and nodded. Right? Yes, of course. I actually wanted to ask you about a student in your class. Huh? But what the foo? Hell makes you think I pay attention to any of those extras? Her eyes flashed at the words, like she knew more than she was letting on, but she simply said, of course. I just thought there may have been something you overheard or saw accidentally. Whatever. Just ask your stupid questions if it'll get me out of this hallway faster. He said, crossing his arms over his chest. All right. Well, I was wondering if you've noticed any abnormal behavior from your classmate Izuku Midoriya. Katsuki stiffened slightly at the name, lips turning downward into a glower. But you think something's going on with Deku? Deku? Yeah, that's what I call him. Got a problem with that? Her lips quirked up into a small smile at his answer, but her eyes radiated concern for someone who wasn't there with them. Not as long as he doesn't. To answer your question, I'm not really sure. I've just seen him in class and walking through the halls a few times, and I couldn't help but notice how tired and forlorn he appears. Katsuki noticed too. He saw how the exhaustion was affecting him. He saw the way those green eyes looked like they were constantly on the brink of tears. But he wouldn't tell her that, wouldn't admit to watching the other boy so closely. I don't know what to tell you, lady. If you want to know if he's all right, ask him yourself. She didn't seem surprised by his answer at all. She simply nodded and dismissed him with a soft, right, as if she was expecting it. Katsuki left before he could get too irritated. Katsuki kicked a stray pebble, sending it flying far off into the distance. He watched it soar through the air but lost sight of it before it landed. He sighed and lifted his leg, preparing to launch another one. She noticed too, Katsuki thought, the memory from earlier still clear as day in his mind. If someone else was noticing Deku's weird behavior, that meant it wasn't all just in Katsuki's head. Not that he ever thought it was, anyway. He was sure something was up, and Katsuki Bakugos was never wrong. A fact that was proven correct, once again, when he'd gone to the convenience store with the extras. Except he'd ultimately left that store with more questions than answers. He'd accused the nerd of valuing money over education, but he didn't really believe that. Deku was obviously trying his hardest to keep up in class despite all the stress he was under. But then why did he have a job? Did he owe somebody money? Did his parents force him to get a job? Was he saving up for something? Also, why did it tire him out so much? As much as he hated to admit it, it took a lot to affect Deku so much. He doubted a single part-time job alone would be enough to wear him down so much. And finally, what was wrong with Deku's arm? Katsuki hadn't grabbed him hard enough to warrant the kind of response he'd gotten. Katsuki sighed, entering his home and kicking off his shoes as his mother greeted him. "Hey brat, how was school today?" she asked, a bright smile on her face and her hands on her hips. She was wearing a white apron smeared with grease, a sign that she'd been cooking. Her food was good, but she always made a mess of the kitchen and herself. "None of your business, old hag. Have some respect for your mother, you little sheet. I just asked how your day was," she reprimanded, crossing her arms over her chest and trading her smile out for a stern frown. Katsuki rolled his eyes and clicked his tongue. "It was fine. Happy." She huffed and shook her head, but a small smile was already tugging her lips upward again. "Yeah, alright. Would it kill you to just answer your mother correctly once in a while?" At Katsuki's silence, she just sighed and turned around, heading back to the kitchen. "I'll call you down for dinner, alright brat?" Yeah, the blonde said, already climbing up the stairs towards his bedroom. He shut the door behind him and made a beeline for his bed, collapsing elegantly on the blankets like a beached starfish. He had a lot of thinking to do. After all, something was definitely wrong with Deku, and Katsuki planned on figuring out what that something was, whether the little sheet liked it or not. Today was a good day, Izuku decided as he pushed open the doors of Aldra Junior High and filled his lungs with fresh air. Today was a good day because, for once, he didn't have anything to do, and his head felt as clear as the open, sunny sky. He was supposed to work every other day, i.e. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, and trained every single day of the week except Friday, which meant, unfortunately, there was hardly ever a day he didn't have to do one or the other unless his work schedule changed. It was admittedly very tiring, but he was okay with that. Working all the time meant his mind was occupied. The daunting presence of that dark rain cloud and the overwhelming pressure of rising to expectations could momentarily take a back seat. But today was different. Today, his brain was unusually quiet. He had gotten used to the low, constant buzz that had made its home in his head, so the silence was a nice change. On top of that, he'd taken an extra shift on Tuesday to cover one of his coworkers, and in return they'd taken his shift on Friday. Which meant that today, to his endless gratitude, his afternoon was all his to enjoy as he wished. He walked through the throngs of students, a slight bounce in his step. He swung his head around wildly, taking in the pretty way the trees swayed in the breeze and the ripples of light in the koi pond as the sun reflected off it. He took time to appreciate the little flower buds pushing their way through the soil, the sound of birds chirping and laughter from the various conversations around him, the way the world dimmed slightly and the air got cooler as a cloud passed over the sun. He studied everything carefully, his eyes roaming over everything in sight and committing it to memory. He hadn't felt this peaceful in a while, and he was determined to enjoy it fully, damn it. With a small smile gracing his lips, Izuku stepped off school property and onto the sidewalk. What should I do today? It's my one day off, I should make the most of it, he thought. Because he didn't usually get breaks like this, deciding what to do felt so important. He didn't want to waste this opportunity. It feels like I should do something productive with this time. Like I should do something meaningful or maybe just as many things as possible. But, wouldn't it just be best to do what I want to do? What do I want to do? He put a finger to his lips, humming to himself in thought as his legs worked on autopilot, guiding him down the same familiar streets he'd walked hundreds of times before. Well, Mom isn't going to be home for a while yet, so maybe I could do something fun for a change? Maybe something like the arcade? The thought sparked a small flutter of excitement in his chest, and Izuku brought a hand up to clutch at the fabric of his uniform jacket. A small, warm smile curved his lips at the somewhat unfamiliar feeling. Yeah, the arcade sounded great. Izuku, blissfully unaware of the fiery red orbs that latched onto him from across the room, strode through the arcade door and took a deep breath in, appreciating the stale scent of nacho cheese and pennies. The old, frayed carpet dulled the sound of his shoes hitting the floor, creating lame thumps as he walked past the rows of games and candy dispensers. It's been far too long, he thought, eyes trailing over both the old, boxy machines and the newer ones, all sleek and colorful and flashy. Excitement bubbled up in his chest once again, and a new sort of buzzing flooded his nerves. It brought a smile to his face and made his fingers twitch in anticipation. Far too long indeed. Izuku jogged over to the front counter and pulled out his wallet. While he gave almost all of the money he earned to his mother, he still kept a small portion for himself. After all, being away from home all day after school meant he had to buy his own dinner every night. The food he bought was pretty good. It had to be with all the calories he burned and muscles he tore every day, but he couldn't help but miss his mother's cooking. Hopefully he'd get to taste it again soon. He glanced up at the woman behind the counter as he opened his wallet, hand poised over it. The woman had curly orange hair, half tied in a messy bun, and was clad in a boring brown uniform. He didn't recognize her, something he was particularly relieved by. He really wasn't looking for a confrontation with one of his school bullies today. How much for some game tokens? He asked, sounding meek and hesitant even to his own ears. Despite not knowing her, and therefore not really having to worry about any harassment, he couldn't help but be nervous anyway. He'd been stripped of any self-confidence and wasn't used to interacting with others normally anymore. The woman, however, didn't seem to notice. Or she did and just didn't care. Honestly, Izuku wasn't worried about it. He was just thankful that she left him alone. 100 yen for 10 tokens. She told him, resting her head in her hand and looking impossibly bored. Izuku simply nodded and pulled out a few 100 yen bills, handing them over. She filled up a baggie for him with the appropriate amount and handed them over, her glossy red nails standing out against the scratchy brown fabric. Izuku took it gingerly and threw a slightly less shaky, "Thank you," over his shoulder as he skipped over to one of the flashier and more colorful games. Internally marveling at the weight of the bag in his hands, at the sounds of games being played and prize tickets being dispensed, it all felt too good to be true. But as he tried various machines, playing and failing at most of them, nothing bad happened. He spent hours going to each and every machine, making multiple trips to the front counter for more tokens, slowly accumulated a large amount of tickets, so many that they filled his arms and dragged on the floor behind him, and he'd had to get a bag to put them in, and he did it all in peace. Maybe this wasn't the calm before the storm, like he'd thought. A cliché, over-processed zombie growl sounded from the machine Izuku currently had his fake gun pointed at, signaling his death, and thus, his failure. He pouted at the bloody, "You died," and reluctantly put the gun back in its spot, grumbling to himself all the while. He kind of wanted to try again, but he'd wasted too many tokens on it already. The green-haired boy knew his limitations, and this game was definitely outside them. So instead, he stepped away and began walking around, looking for something he hadn't played yet. He circled the entire building, encountering only games he'd played multiple times already, and almost gave up and decided to call it a day, when he spotted two girls getting off the Dance Dance Revolution set. He'd seen it earlier and wanted to play it, but every time he neared it someone else would rush in and take it over. This was his chance. That was super hard. How can you do it so easily? Get good, girl. Takes practice. Izuku approached the DDR machine as the two girls left, talking animatedly with one another. He eyed the colors, the arrows, the bars, and felt eagerness begin thrumming through his veins. He tentatively stepped up onto the machine and popped a few tokens in. He scrolled through the songs aimlessly, not really paying attention to what he was looking at. He clicked a song at random and put it on normal difficulty. He really didn't want the shame and embarrassment of potentially failing on easy, and he wasn't cocky enough to put it on hard for his first try. The steady beat started up, followed closely by electronic-sounding music and the voice of a woman. Izuku recognized the song instantly as 1, 2 Step, and felt his cheeks warm slightly, but he didn't have much time to dwell on his self-consciousness before arrows started coming up on the screen and he was forced to focus. He was absolutely horrible. At first. In the beginning, his movements were sloppy and he often missed the arrows, he couldn't really get the timing down, and sometimes his brain would stall and he just couldn't process what was happening on the screen. But he learned quickly, his body adjusting to the rhythm and all of the information he was being given faster than he'd thought himself capable of. He finished the song with a passing score of C, and despite it not being that high of a score, he couldn't help but feel proud of himself. Immediately, he was feeding the machine more tokens and choosing another song. He picked a song called Twilight Zone, and once again, put it on normal. He did much better the second time around, his feet finding their place with growing ease and his analytical mind comprehending the directions on screen with increasing speed. With the confidence boost of getting a high B, he continued playing, getting better with each song. Exhaustion and exhilaration burned hotly inside him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt that happy, had that much fun, been so carefree. He didn't even notice the small crowd that had gathered around him to watch him dance. His eyes stayed focused on the screen even as his body twisted and turned. His feet hit the arrows swiftly and steadily, his foot tapping down lightly before moving instantly to hit the next one. He was tired and sweaty, but it was a weariness he could get used to. It was one he appreciated and longed for. Maybe he thought, I should take my coworkers' shifts more often. Finally, as the intense finishing notes of Kakumiai played out, his perfect score displayed proudly on screen, he realized he'd run out of tokens and accumulated another impressive pile of tickets. Oh, and he was also being watched by half the arcade. He flushed bright red, from the tips of his ears to the dips of his collarbones, when he turned only to make eye contact with a dozen different people. The confidence he'd garnered earlier fizzled out in the span of a second, his insecurity leaving him an awkward, stuttering mess all over again. The people around him clapped politely, and a few even cheered, but Izuku was too mortified to do much more than nod appreciatively at them and book it with his tickets. Even as he escaped and the crowd dispersed, Izuku could swear he felt the heat of a gaze boring into him. He turned around, examining the crowd briefly, but before his search could garner any results, a mocking voice dragged him from his thoughts. Hey, aren't you that weird quirkless kid from school? He whipped his head around to see a guy, Kuro, his name tag helpfully supplied, with dark gray hair and matching irises standing in the spot the other girl had been before. He had a piercing in one ear and a wide, menacing grin that showed off his abnormally sharp canines. Izuku felt his stomach sink as recognition and delight flashed in the boy's eyes. He'd come to the counter to exchange his tickets for a present his mother would like, but it seemed as though that wouldn't be happening. At least not with the way the guy was leaning towards him, looking entirely too amused at the way Izuku instinctively shrunk away. You are, he purred, his rancid breath hitting Izuku in the face. The timid boy had to use every ounce of willpower he had not to bring a hand up and clamp it around his nose as the stink curled around him. What the f are you doing here, huh? Trying to pretend like you're normal? Kuro laughed. You don't belong here, freak. Even though his words were harsh, he didn't look annoyed or angry. He simply looked entertained. Izuku's mood crashed. I just want to get a prize, he started, willing himself to look into the other boy's eyes. I'll go away then. The gray-haired boy raised a thin eyebrow. Really? He said, and why should I listen to someone like you? Despite the fear and uneasiness festering inside him, Izuku refused to back down. He wanted a gift for his mother. Please. The prize isn't for me, he tried, his pride swelling slightly at the lack of stuttering. The guy rolled his eyes and leaned over on the counter, getting comfortable. I don't give a sheet who it goes to in the end. I ain't giving sheet to you. He told him, his amusement beginning to wane. Come on. I haven't done anything to you. Izuku pleaded, his frustration temporarily overpowering his sense of self-preservation. Kuro scowled deeply at the raise in Izuku's voice, the mirth in his eyes replaced quickly by disdain. He moved out from behind the counter, walking briskly towards an increasingly fearful Izuku. "You talkin' back to me, you useless F-dash?" He spat, reaching out to grasp Izuku's shoulder. The green-haired boy squeaked in alarm and clenched his eyes shut as he was shoved, fully expecting to land hard on his butt, but was instead met with the feeling of a hard chest slamming against his back. He slowly opened his eyes, confused, and was met with the sight of Kuro looking over his head with a stunned look on his face. Before he could turn around and figure out for himself what the hell was going on, strong hands were gripping his biceps and righting him. "You fing nerd, can't do sheep by yourself, can you?" The familiar voice had Izuku whirling around at warp speeds, his heart in his throat. Sure enough, upon turning, he was met with an intense red glare and iconic blonde spikes. Kacchan, what are you dash? Bakugo? The F-dash? Why are you defending this quirkless failure? Kuro cut him off. He was essentially asking the same thing Izuku was going to, though, so he didn't pay the interruption much mind. Kacchan scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest and looking everywhere but at Izuku. "What the hell did you want, Deku?" The statement was phrased like a question, but it sounded more like a demand. Kacchan why dash? Shut the f-up. Just point at what you want, he snapped. Izuku was absolutely bewildered but did what he was asked regardless, lifting a shaky hand to point at a cute stuffed animal he thought his mother might like. Kacchan snatched Izuku's tickets and slammed them down on the counter, making Kuro jump. "Get the nerd the FNG stuffed animal already," he ordered. There was a warning in his voice that had Kuro backing up, heeding his request with no questions asked lest he get an explosion to the face. It was silent as the gray-haired boy retrieved the toy, the air thick with tension. Once the fluffy, stuffed animal was clutched safely between Izuku's freckled hands, Kacchan turned to leave, still refusing to meet the shorter boy's eyes. "And I'm not defending anybody, you stupid F-dash. I just don't like you," he said, turning briefly to glare holes into Kuro's skull. Izuku watched him leave silently, still trying to process what just happened. Kacchan helped him? But was this just a one-time thing? Maybe he really did just have something against Kuro? Or maybe this was the beginning of a trend? No, he chastised himself, best not to question a good thing. Whatever the reason, Kacchan had helped him get a gift for his mother, and he spent the entire rest of the way home skipping and smiling down at it. Inko cooed at the stuffed animal the second she saw it, hands still poised over the stove from where she was cooking dinner. "Is that for me?" she asked, and at Izuku's nod, moved away from the stove to wrap her son up in her arms. Once she let him go, she took the cute stuffed animal and set it on the counter, safely tucked against the wall and next to the bread box. "Thank you, Izuku, you're so sweet." She finished the exclamation with a kiss to his forehead and went back to the stove, leaving Izuku to follow so he could help. It felt so good to be home at a reasonable time, for once. It was so nice to be able to talk with his mother, help her cook dinner, and eat homemade food. He worked diligently, helping his mother whenever she needed it and setting the table when they were just about done. The excitement he felt at the arcade had all but faded now, replaced by the warm feeling of contentment. His stomach twisted uncomfortably when he tried to think about what tomorrow would be like, though, so he didn't. He'd deal with tomorrow. For now, he just wanted, more than anything, to enjoy this time with his mother. They sat and ate in comfortable silence, nothing but the sound of chopsticks scraping the bottom of ceramic plates filling the room. The food was delicious. There was just something about the taste of good homemade food that you couldn't replicate anywhere else, and it had been far too long since he'd had any, in Izuku's opinion. About halfway through dinner, the green-haired woman broke the silence. "So, Izuku, this is the first time in a while we've both been home at the same time. We haven't really gotten the chance to talk about your job," she said. Izuku glanced up from his plate, chopsticks halfway to his open mouth. Yeah, what about it?" he asked, slightly nervous. He knew how protective his mother was of him. Unless it was something he just really wanted to do, she wasn't likely to let him keep the job. You gave almost all your money to me. I don't want you to feel obligated to do something like this, honey. I'm doing just fine on my own. She offered him a warm smile, but the bags under her eyes and the various hidden envelopes contradicted her words. Izuku just smiled back at her, soft and sincere. I know, ma. I just really wanted the experience, and I don't really have a lot of need for money, so I figured I might as well help you out. He insisted. So you're doing this for yourself? Inko asked, her eyes scouring Izuku's face for any hint that he was lying. Why, yes. He lied. He was terrible at lying, but so was his mother, and because of that she almost never caught him. Her eyes studied him a little longer, eyebrows pinching in concentration, but finally she relaxed, letting out a long sigh. All right, as long as you're doing this with yourself in mind and you aren't in over your head, she relented, but please, if it becomes too much for you, quit. I know how it feels to work tirelessly. I don't want that for my son. Izuku smiled at her, affection warming his heart. He had such an amazing mother, he didn't deserve her. Of course, Mom, he told her. The job was really already too much for him, but he wasn't about to admit that to his mother, he wouldn't even really admit that to himself. The rest of their night together was filled with the many questions of his doting mother. Izuku answered every one, immensely grateful just to be able to spend the last few hours of his day next to her. He was breaking, a piece of glass that had been stepped on one too many times. He was covered in cracks, some of his pieces gone for good, but he wouldn't let it cripple him. He would keep pushing forward. If for no one else, if not for the legacy he was meant to uphold, then for the woman beside him. She deserved the world, and one day he would give it to her. Even with darkness lurking in the corners, Izuku slept easy that night, his dreams free, for once, of scalding explosions and dark curls. The storm could wait for another day. Izuku stepped quietly into the stillness of his small apartment living room and closed the door gently behind him. It was such a relief to finally be home. His feet were killing him from standing up most of the day, his head throbbed with a dull, constant pain, and his muscles were sore beyond belief. He moved further into the house and groaned softly at the leftover ache that riddled his body. The strain in his limbs as he struggled to walk was a constant reminder of the expectations he was meant to meet, and he couldn't help thinking back to the conversation he'd had with All Might earlier in the day. Are you sure you're all right, young Midoriya? You aren't doing any extra training, are you? All Might had asked right after Izuku had, once again, collapsed to his knees in the middle of training. His striking blue irises shone with concern and stood out harshly against the sunken pools he called eyes. Izuku was hardly more than simply the other man's student, essentially just a suitable vessel for something far greater than himself, but it felt as though the hero genuinely cared about Izuku as a person, not only as the boy's mentor. The green-haired boy felt his heart jump into his throat at the thought. His idol, his childhood hero, the person he admired oh so much, genuinely cared for him. Since the day Izuku turned 4 years old, he'd only known the love of his mother. In a world where greatness was the new average, Izuku was simply inadequate. He was the runt of the litter, weak and frail, made from scraps and left behind. Only he wasn't properly nurtured like the cute, unfortunate kittens or puppies were. Instead, Izuku was put through hell, forced to endure torment after torment, trial after trial, with seemingly no end in sight, and in the face of his suffering, his peers did nothing but laugh. His friends abandoned him and in their place stood bullies, showering him in physical reminders of exactly what made him different. What made him so impossibly useless. And it hurt so bad partly because he was useless. He always had been, even before the universe announced it to the world in the form of indisputable genetics. So hearing All Might ask, so earnestly if he was okay, was almost too sweet. It was a tune he wasn't used to hearing, and he was almost afraid of becoming addicted to it. However nice it was, though, no matter how much he truly appreciated it, he couldn't exactly tell All Might the truth. He couldn't just say, well, actually, All Might, in my attempts to be a good son I've become exhausted beyond what my body can handle reliably, my mental health is in shambles and I'm scared to properly acknowledge it, and honestly I'm absolutely terrified I won't be good enough to inherit this power from you. Don't worry though, I'll be fine, I can keep doing this. Yeah, no, that wouldn't go over well. The other might deem him unsuitable, after all, and look for another successor. He couldn't risk that. Even with everything that was going on, even though he was afraid, he still wanted more than anything to become a hero. He'd be a hero like All Might and wear a smile on his face so that others wouldn't have to. That was his dream, and now that it was within reach, there was no way he was going to let it pass him by. He'd stretch his fingers as far as they would go, with both hands, and grasp onto it with everything he had. Thus he lied, however horribly. Tugging his long sleeves down further, ensuring any evidence stayed hidden, he choked out, I'm fine. I get really thirsty. Really fast. I'll be fine as soon as I get some water. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, All Might was just about as oblivious as it got. He wasn't good at picking up on any sort of lie or ulterior motive. It was an endearing but sometimes dangerous trait. Oh, all right. That makes sense, I think, the tall man said, nodding along in affirmation as he rolled the new information around in his head. Let's take a short break then. The timid boy smiled and hummed his agreement, getting up on quivering legs to join All Might. Relief washed over him at the success of his lie and his mind quieted, if only for a little while. He could do this. No, he would do this. Izuku curled his hand into a fist, a flicker of determination igniting inside him at the memory. No matter what, he wouldn't fail. Someday, he'd become someone others cheered for and relied on rather than someone to scorn and toss aside. He'd earned the love and respect of not only the people around him but the boy inside himself, the one who was told, too young, that he was nothing and believed it. He bobbed his head once in a show of commitment, and left it at that, letting his hand fall back to his side. His legs were getting real tired just standing around in the middle of the living room, so he began his trek down the hallway in order to get ready for bed. When Izuku opened the bathroom door to leave, mouth minty and freshly cleaned, the first thing he saw was big green eyes staring right at him. He screeched embarrassingly shrilly, weaving his fingers into the fabric of his shirt like that would stop his heart attack dead in its tracks. His mother chuckled softly at his reaction and muttered an apologetic, I didn't mean to scare you, but there was something about the way she regarded him that seemed hesitant. Izuku could feel himself getting put on edge even as he relaxed, studying her face curiously. What are you doing up this late, Mom? Didn't you go to bed already? Inko pulled her bottom lip between her teeth, avoiding eye contact. He was getting more suspicious by the second. Yes, well, I wasn't really sleeping well, she confessed. Oh, are you having nightmares or something? Izuku asked, his eyebrows scrunching up in concern. Inko shook her head, though, her green locks spilling over her shoulders at the movement. No, nothing like that, promise. It's just... She trailed off, clearly reluctant to share whatever was on her mind. Sympathy swelled within Izuku, as he understood how it felt to be unable to open up. There were some things that were just impossible to talk about, at least at first. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, Mom. Let me just put on some tea for you and we can watch some TV together until you get tired. He offered. His mother stared at him openly with nothing but affection, her lips quirking up slightly at the corners. Izuku could swear he even saw a few tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Oh, Izuku, you're so sweet. I don't know how I got blessed with such a wonderful son, she praised, and the younger immediately went to wave off the words, always the first to try and downplay himself. Before he could, though, her warm expression began to falter once again. But I have to tell you, I already told Mitsuki. It's not really something I can just keep to myself. Izuku, although growing more worried by the second, simply nodded encouragingly. For a long moment, Inko was silent, staring at the carpet as she seemingly steeled herself for what she was about to say. Finally, she lifted her gaze to meet his eyes, green searching green. Your father, Hisashi, called me earlier. He's coming home. Katsuki lifted his chopsticks from his bowl, several spicy noodles hanging limply from between the wooden sticks. He didn't even bother to blow on them, despite how steam still rose steadily from the bowl of yaki udon his mother had made them. He just slurped them up, downing half the bowl in seconds flat without so much as a flinch. The blonde would never admit it, but he always loved sitting down to eat when it was his mother's turn to cook. She always made the food extra spicy, much to Katsuki's delight and the old man's dismay. Said man sat across from Katsuki, chugging glasses of milk in between bites of spicy udon and smiling apologetically at his wife when she turned offended eyes on him. All these years and you still can't handle my cooking? You big baby! The old hag exclaimed, huffing indignantly before shoveling a mouthful of food past her lips. I'm I'm sorry. My tongue just really isn't meant for such spice, honey, the brunette chuckled sheepishly. The old hag rolled her eyes, but there was a small lilt to her lips that betrayed her enjoyment of the banter. Katsuki snorted. His parents were such idiots. Oh please, even our son can endure more spice than you. Katsuki glanced up from his already nearly empty bowl at the mention of his name, already perched at the edge of his lips. Honey, Katsuki can handle more spice than even you. Shut it. Katsuki growled, his annoyance having already built up tremendously. Both of you shut up. He snapped, earning a hard smack on the top of his head from his mother and a smothered laugh from his father. There goes another pair of chopsticks, he thought, watching the broken halves fall to the table completely unapologetically. Them anyway. Flimsy would deserved it. His mother threw another pair at his face, the wood smacking softly against his skin before clattering to the table, while his father threw the broken pieces away. Katsuki broke the utensils practically every night. It was essentially routine. Didn't mean he didn't still get chewed out for it though. D'you mean it, brat? Stop breaking the FNG chopsticks. Do you think money grows on trees or something? The old hag complained, stabbing her own chopsticks into her poor noodles a little harder than necessary. It is very endearing, but your mother is right. It can get a little costly always buying new ones, the old man stated, calm as ever. Shut the F up, old man. Smith. The sound of a phone ringing interrupted the, don't you talk to your father that way, you little sheet. The old hag was surely about to deliver. Said woman sighed and excused herself to the kitchen to answer it, leaving Katsuki to grumble angrily and rub at the knot forming on the crown of his head. The old man laughed at the sight and smiled warmly at his son before pushing his and his wife's empty bowls towards him. Why don't you take the dishes to the sink? It will put your mother in a good mood. He suggested. Katsuki grunted, a small noise of discontent, but got up and did as his father said anyway, piling the dishes up in his arms and heading to the kitchen. As he got closer, he could start to make out his mother's side of the phone conversation. Really? Are you sure? He heard her ask, sounding hesitant and worried. He passed his mother on the way to the sink, but she didn't seem to notice, her back turned to him. It was silent for a moment as he approached the sink, putting the dishes in as quietly as possible when his mother spoke up again. I know you're excited, but dash. Yeah, no, I get it, she finished with a sigh. The blonde woman crossed an arm over her chest, folding her hand into the dip of her elbow as she held the phone. Her eyes glared holes into the ground, and Katsuki decided that whatever that conversation was about was entirely too serious for casual eavesdropping, slipping out of the kitchen just as quietly as he'd entered and making his way back to the table to wipe away any crumbs or minor spills. His father was still seated at the table, now with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and the addition of multiple, scattered sheets of white printed paper splayed out before him. Katsuki snorted at him. You're so boring, old man, he commented snarkily, but there was only mirth behind it. The old man looked up at the sound of his son's voice and huffed out a harsh, breathy laugh. Would you like to do the taxes instead, son? Is that a FING challenge? Someone cleared their throat loudly by the entryway, and both pairs of eyes turned to see the old hag standing there, a look of excitement decorating her features. Katsuki raised his eyebrows a bit at the sight. It was completely different than the expression he'd seen just a few moments ago in the kitchen. His slight shock over her change in outward appearance didn't even compare to the level of surprise he felt at her. Next words, we're going to a party at the Midoriyas tomorrow, boys, she exclaimed, glancing back and forth between their faces expectantly. The old man hummed and nodded. Is that so? It has been quite a while since I've seen Inko. It'll be fun to catch up. But what are we celebrating exact dash? Ha! Katsuki screeched, utterly confused and marginally alarmed. Was it the nerd's birthday? Even if it was, they hadn't been over to celebrate it in years. Plus, Deku hadn't really seemed like he would be in the mood for any kind of party, so he doubted it was his idea. Maybe one of his parents got a promotion or something. Did one of his parents get a promotion or something? Katsuki asked, voicing the only plausible theory he could come up with in the span of 5 or so seconds. What? The old hag questioned, looking at Katsuki with an expression of utter perplexity. No, where did you even get that idea? Before he could respond, however, her cheerful facade slipped somewhat, exposing the unsure, serious look Katsuki had witnessed earlier. Inko is throwing a welcome-back party for Izuku's father, Hisashi, she said, voice suspiciously solemn. Katsuki's eyebrows furrowed. His dad was gone? You didn't know that? The older woman appeared absolutely flabbergasted. The old man, however, just nodded and turned to answer his son properly. Yes. I'm also a bit surprised you didn't know, but Hisashi left when Izuku was only 4 years old. As far as your mother and I know, nobody has heard from him in 10 years. His return is a bit of a big deal. Katsuki's mind stuttered. He felt like the cogs in his head just stopped working, spewing out puffs of black smoke that were sure to start leaking out of his ears at any moment. Deku had been fatherless for 10 whole years and Katsuki didn't know? He hadn't had a clue. Until recently, Katsuki had never had a reason to think anything was amiss in the Midoriya household. Maybe, was this the reason Deku needed money? It makes sense, he thought. Supporting a kid all by yourself can be expensive. Deku probably got that job just for her. If that was true, Katsuki knew even less than he thought he did, which was already, admittedly, not much. He didn't really know how to feel about that. Though even if the blonde had known earlier, would it have changed anything? Would the volatile boy have drained his voice of its usual searing acid? Would he have let the greenette simply watch the fireworks dance in his palms instead of forcing him to feel their sting? Would he have offered him a helping hand instead of pushing him into the dirt? Probably not, he thought to himself, watching absently as his mother and father continued the conversation amongst themselves. Katsuki didn't really know what to think about that, either. Wait, Katsuki interrupted whatever his parents were saying, something suddenly occurring to him. Why the hell did the guy leave in the first place? The old hag and old man exchanged uncertain looks at the question, filling the air with tension. Katsuki started to get antsy in the silence, but before he could yell at them to spit it out already, the old man was sighing and leaning forward on the table. We don't really know why he left. That's part of the reason why your mother and I are so suspicious of his sudden return, he said. Though his voice was calm, his face was pinched in concern. Katsuki nodded slowly, his eyes shifting out of focus as he drank in the newly discovered details. His parents, thankfully, seemed to recognize that he needed some time to absorb everything he was just told and left the room to continue their conversation elsewhere. Why did Hisashi leave? How bad is their financial situation if Deku got a job because of it? What else has this affected that I didn't know about? Katsuki crossed his arms and glared vacantly at the chips in the wooden table. Why do I even want to know? Izuku shoved his hand beneath the running faucet, digging his fingers into hard grains of rice and scrubbing them clean. His mother hummed softly from the stove beside him, various vegetables, meats and sauces sizzling away and filling the air with a salty, delectable aroma. Once the green-haired boy deemed the rice sufficiently cleansed, he scooped the sodden grains out into a red bowl and handed them to his mother, who smiled gratefully back at him. It's a little hard to believe I'm cooking dinner for your father again. It's been so long, she commented, back turned to Izuku so she could get the rice cooking. It really is so exciting, isn't it? Izuku hummed as he thought, trying to formulate a response. On one hand, he was happy and excited, hopeful that maybe, just maybe, they could be a real family again, that his father had changed in the time he'd been gone. It had been so long since he'd last seen his father, and that memory was painful. Perhaps, this time, he would stay. He could quit his job with his father's help and his mother would finally have time for herself again. She'd have someone to lean on, to talk to love in a way she hadn't in so many years. Izuku wanted nothing more than for that future to come to fruition. On the other hand, though, he knew things wouldn't turn out the way he so longed for them to. He wouldn't get the life he yearned for because, sadly, he didn't live in a fairy tale, and it seemed he was always destined to pull the short end of the stick. Realistically, he knew his father showing up out of nowhere after his dramatic exit 10 years ago probably wasn't the most promising of occurrences. He knew he should hate him, that he should resent the cold, callous man who took the last of his childlike innocence and stomped on it with such a cold detachment. Izuku often wondered if Hisashi ever loved him at all. But Izuku was an optimist, and he'd hold on to that, even if the reality was bleak. Especially if the reality was bleak. Izuku was aware that clinging to false hope wasn't the wisest decision, but it was all he had. If he wasn't constantly looking for that light at the end of the tunnel, following the North Star he'd built from childhood band-aids and hung like the posters spread on his bedroom walls, then he wouldn't have anything to guide him. He'd wind up stranded, running after his dreams with 2 broken legs. So, however stupid it may have been, Izuku smiled and said, "Yeah, it is." Inko nodded, pleased, and swirled around, instantly occupied with rummaging through the cupboards for their nice-looking dishes. Izuku leaned over and flicked off the stove for her, knowing she'd already forgotten. The green-haired woman tended to become increasingly frazzled under pressure, turning forgetful and frantic. Izuku, having lived with her all his life, knew this and always volunteered to help out when she wanted to make a big meal. Though they hadn't had the time or reason to do that in a long while. Izuku wiped his still damp hands on his shorts and grabbed a pile of plates. His arms complained at the extra weight, still sore from yesterday's workout, but the greenette made his way over to the dining table with them anyway. He plopped the stack down with a small grunt, just beginning to distribute them around the empty table when a loud knock sounded from across the room. Must be Mitsuki and Masu, he thought, jogging over to the waiting door. It's been so long since I last saw them. He reached the door and quickly unlocked it, face already consumed by a genuinely warm and welcoming smile. Even though he wasn't really on the best terms with Kacchan and had stopped visiting some time ago, the Bakugos parents had always continued to love Izuku, and Izuku them. It quickly became obvious upon opening the door, however, that Mitsuki and Masaru had not, in fact, arrived yet. Instead of a couple with heads of spiky hair and open, welcoming arms, he was met with the sight of a tall, intimidating man, a large brown suitcase hanging limply from his clenched fist and a dark suit enveloping his body. His sharp, angular face was framed by black curls, a light smattering of freckles draped across the bridge of his nose and disappearing into the dips of his cheekbones. Dark green eyes bored impassively into the smaller boy, igniting the latter's nerves with a rush of adrenaline and nearly jump-starting his fight-or-flight instincts. "D-Dad? D-Dad?" The word floated around them, its echo filling the otherwise silent space. His father looked entirely unimpressed, impatient to get inside, but Izuku's brain had short-circuited the second he saw the older man. His father, the first of many to break him and a man he hadn't seen for most of his life, was right there, standing in their apartment doorway like he was just getting home from a short visit to the market for milk. Hisashi seemed to catch on to the fact Izuku wasn't entirely there and cleared his throat loudly, pulling Izuku's awareness back to him in an instant. Said boy squeaked and flushed red, moving out of the way so fast he almost tripped on his own 2 feet. Hisashi didn't look at him as he entered, brushing past Izuku with an air of superiority and arrogance that rivaled even Kacchan's. The green-haired boy pushed the door closed behind him gently, a rising sense of dread forming a pit in his stomach. Just from that short exchange, Izuku could tell. Hisashi did change, for the worse. An excited voice flitted from the kitchen entryway and Izuku turned to see his mother talking animatedly with her long-lost ex-husband. The dark-haired man was playing a completely different tune, now, all smiles and polished charisma. It was a mask, and a damn good one at that. But he wouldn't go over there and try to rip it off right in front of his mother. She seemed so happy and excited to see Hisashi again, Izuku couldn't take that away from her. He'd put up with anything and everything if it meant her happiness. It was the least he could do for her. Ignoring the lively conversation taking place next to him, Izuku got to work setting the table. Katsuki grumbled aggravatedly, arms crossed over his chest and red eyes burning holes into the flat, wooden surface of Deku's front door. He did not want to be here. Wanting to know what was wrong with the stupid nerd did not mean he cared about him and certainly didn't mean he wanted to hang out with the little sheet. He deduced the night before that his interest in Deku's problems was purely derived from curiosity, anger at Deku for possibly being weak and letting little sheet get him down when he was constantly spouting shit about going to UA, and his own, admittedly inane, need to know anything and everything. He justified his meddling further by marking this as his starting line. If he couldn't even help shitty, dumbass Deku, then what kind of hero could he possibly turn out to be? He refused to think about any alternative reasons because if he was doing this for something other than the things he'd already come up with, then that would mean he really didn't know himself as well as he thought he did. It would mean sitting down and re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about himself, and he was not ready to do that. Not that he had to, anyway. There were no other reasons. He was drawn out of his thoughts by the loud, resounding booms his mother's fist made on the door as she knocked. Old hag never knew how to hold back. The door swung open moments later, revealing an excitable-looking Deku. The freckled boy was drowning in an oversized pink hoodie that contrasted his light green shorts. Nerd looked like a FING watermelon, a stark difference from Katsuki's outfit of a simple gray sweatshirt and black joggers. Deku scanned his parents' faces with skyrocketing enthusiasm but faltered slightly when his gaze landed on Katsuki. Katsuki could feel himself bristle slightly and gripped his biceps harshly to keep from acting out. The nerd didn't even he know I was coming? How the hell had he missed that memo? Deku recovered quickly, adorning a facade that hid his nervousness poorly and hastily welcomed them inside. Katsuki dragged his feet on the thinning carpet as he stepped inside and glanced around the living room. It had been a long time since he'd been in this house. Everything was in place, the house impeccably clean and the furniture looking as if it had never even been touched. There was a small bookshelf that had obviously been cleaned recently, but the small coating of dust covering the spines of the books crammed in it betrayed how much it was actually used. There were picture frames sitting neatly on just about every flat surface and more hung up on the walls. There were pictures of a young Deku everywhere and even more of Deku and Auntie together, but there was only one that included Hisashi. It sat on the coffee table, dust coating the edges of the stand on the back of the black frame. The picture itself had obviously been torn and taped back together. There was a thin line cutting through Hisashi's shoulder, separating his form from Deku's small, smiling figure and Auntie, and the tape, despite being clear, was easy to see. It had been placed sloppily, the pieces overlapping in some places and folding over in others. A job done by Deku, no doubt. Katsuki snorted at it and pulled his attention back to the other people in the room. The old hag and old man had already made their way over to the table, conversing with Deku cheerfully. Katsuki, although reluctantly, made his way over to the small group as well. Dinner was served not too long after Katsuki had taken his seat, the beautifully crafted dishes being carried out by Auntie and Hisashi. They started up a conversation immediately, filling the room with the sounds of energetic chatter and light-hearted banter, but Katsuki couldn't help but notice the look of slight discomfort plastered on Deku's face. The green-haired boy next to him stared intently down at his food, chopsticks uselessly prodding at the cooling meat chunks in his curry. A small frown kept his lips pulled downward and his eyes strayed all over the room, never landing and focusing on any particular thing. Katsuki clicked his tongue at the sight and kicked Deku's leg beneath the table. The timid boy jolted, his chopsticks falling to the table with a clatter and his chair screeching against the hardwood floor of the dining room loudly. Hush fell over the room and all eyes turned to him immediately. The greenette blushed wildly. He laughed awkwardly and brought up a hand to scratch lightly at his cheek. Sorry. I just accidentally spilled a little food on myself. It was hot and it scared me so white. Sorry, he breathed out, clearly flustered. Katsuki rolled his eyes at the lousy lie, but everyone else either accepted it or shrugged it off, going back to their conversation and, this time, including Deku. Katsuki gave himself a mental pat on the back for a job well done, but then his mother was calling out his name to include him as well. Katsuki scowled. Katsuki, I was just telling Inko and Hisashi about that time you broke the toilet, 'cause the lid scared you by crashing down dash. F off. And Inko had the lovely idea to start telling childhood stories. The old hag finished, smile sweet but eyes full of mischief. Also, she began again, no cussing at the table, brat. Katsuki growled lowly and narrowed his eyes threateningly, but didn't dare speak up against her lest he be smacked in front of the whole demon table. A small snicker sounded from beside him and Katsuki whipped his head around to see Deku with both hands clamped over his mouth and face as red as a tomato, trying to hold in his laughter. As soon as they made eye contact, though, whatever self-control Deku had gathered vanished in an instant, the green-haired boy doubling over in an intense breathless laugh that left him snorting and gasping for air. Katsuki felt his own skin redden from embarrassment and slammed his palm down on the wooden table as he yelled at the greenette to, "Shut the hell up already, him in it." The old hag, of course, reprimanded Katsuki once again for cursing, but Auntie just laughed along with the old man, staring amusedly at the two teens. Hisashi stayed strangely quiet during the whole ordeal, his polite grin seemingly becoming more strained. Katsuki even thought he might have seen a little smoke escaping between the cracks in his pearly whites, but he wasn't sure. He might have just been imagining things, projecting his own anger onto him. Auntie piped up then, successfully distracting the blonde. "So, childhood stories." She started, getting the conversation back on track. The old hag nodded and turned back to the green-haired woman. "So, Inko, got any cute stories about your boy?" Auntie giggled and nodded. "Oh, lots. Did you know he used to call himself, what was it again, Izuku?" Auntie gazed up at the ceiling as she thought, bringing a finger to her lips. "Wasn't it?" She trailed off, and Deku groaned, knowing what was coming next. "Mighty All-Man." Katsuki barked out a short laugh, drinking in the shrill, whiny sounds of Deku's humiliation. "Oh, how sweet, the taste of revenge." "Oh, that's nothing. Katsuki here used to call himself All-Explosion Man Might." The old hag stated, halting Katsuki's gleeful mockery in its tracks. And that was how the rest of dinner went, Katsuki's and Izuku's mothers exchanging funny childhood stories and dooming said children to endless mortification. The old man laughed along and, occasionally, interjected with a story of his own, but Hisashi stayed silent. The man had his lips stretched into a taut smile that seemed suspiciously forced. He certainly wasn't making a very good first impression on Katsuki, who was beginning to doubt that his earlier observations were truly imaginary. Once the sounds of clinking cutlery faded out into nothing and the conversation had died down, it was decided that dinner was over. Auntie started stacking the dishes and picked up a pile to take to the kitchen. Katsuki's parents offered their help and Katsuki's, but Auntie just shook her head and said, "Guests shouldn't have to help clean up. Izuku can get the last stack for me and then I'll see you out." The old hag sighed and shook her head in disapproval, but a fond smile crept its way over her lips as she sat back down. Deku stood up and reached out for the stack of dishes his mother had referred to. His hands were shaking lightly, the nervousness having never completely dissipated despite all the chipper conversation. Katsuki probably would have thought the nerd was just always on edge if he hadn't seen him at the arcade. Back then, he'd been skipping around with a joyous expression on his face, no sign of anxiousness whatsoever when he didn't know Katsuki was there. It meant there had to be a reason, but what was the one here? Was it because Katsuki was there? "It's not like I'm gonna hit him right in front of his FING parents," he thought, though I guess he doesn't really have a way of knowing that. It wouldn't be the worst thing I've done. Katsuki's gut twisted slightly at the thought, but he pretended it didn't. The green-haired boy picked up the stack of dishes and started heading towards the kitchen where his mother was. As he made his way around the table, though, his hip caught on the corner of the table and his shaky hands lost their grip on the smooth porcelain. Deku dove forward with faster reflexes than Katsuki would have ever expected from the nerd and just barely managed to save the plates, though they still clanked loudly and alerted everyone in the room. Auntie came running back in and the old hag and old man both got up immediately to check on Deku, who looked even more nervous than before, trembling slightly and sweat dampening his hairline. Hisashi got up a moment later, shooting a smile towards the concerned adults who were shooting question after question Deku's way and the old hag, who was just making jokes in an attempt to make the greenette feel better. "He's fine, don't worry. I'll help him take the dishes." the man said. The others nodded, and as Hisashi gathered half of the stack in his own arms, sat back down. Katsuki, however, was suspicious. As Hisashi and Deku headed towards the kitchen, Katsuki got up as well, telling everyone he just needed to use the bathroom. Luckily, he was 10 times better at lying than stupid Deku, and nobody questioned him as he left the room. With everyone's backs turned, Katsuki slipped quietly into the kitchen, staying low to the ground and hiding in a corner behind the trash can where he was well out of sight. The smell wasn't exactly pleasant, and the blonde felt far too cramped to be comfortable, but still he stayed, peeking out from behind the trash can to watch Deku and Hisashi. The two deposited their stacks into the sink wordlessly. Hisashi, by all means, looked perfectly calm and collected, but Deku had a white-knuckled grip on the edge of the sink, fear oozing from every pore in his body. It was as if the green-haired boy sensed something Katsuki didn't. "You made quite the scene in there, Izuku," Hisashi rumbled, and suddenly Katsuki could feel it too, the pressure of the simmering anger radiating off the dark-haired man. Deku audibly gulped, his eyes slowly making their way up to meet Hisashi's gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to apologize, knowing him, but he was cut off by his father. "Don't even apologize. I don't want to hear it," Hisashi said before crossing his arms tightly over his chest and sighing deeply. "You know, it's a little disappointing." After a moment of silence, Deku tried again to speak. This time, Hisashi let him. What is? "The fact that despite all the years we've spent apart, you haven't grown at all. You haven't changed or accomplished anything. You are still so completely useless." The man seethed, the lips that were previously smiling and forming kind words dragged down in a ferocious snarl, hatred spilling from them like thick, black tar that apparently had Deku trapped. It held him in place, the green-haired boy doing nothing but standing there, his pupils flitting to the ground and focusing on the cracks in the tile, as his father spit words of disgust in his face. Katsuki willed his hands not to blow up the FING trash can right then and there. "I had hoped you would have become something by now. But you're still just the worthless little kid I made the mistake of bringing into this world." The man shook his head, clicking his tongue in a disapproving manner. "Just try not to give me any more reason to be ashamed of you." Hisashi turned away, then, plastering that fake, cordial expression on his face and stepping out of the kitchen like nothing happened. Deku stayed behind, his wild curls falling forward and hiding his face from view as he dipped his head. A minute passed, and Katsuki contemplated just getting up and revealing himself, but then Deku finally turned around, looking like his normal self and walking out of the kitchen as if his father hadn't just told him he was a mistake. Katsuki stood up as those green curls disappeared out of the doorway, a violent, searing anger coursing through his veins. Katsuki certainly did not like Hisashi, that was for sure. How could a father say such things to his only son? Katsuki had told the boy similar things, he knew, but he wasn't Deku's father. No parent should ever talk to their children like that, no matter what. Katsuki may be a D-, but he wasn't entirely heartless. He would never wish that kind of home life on anyone, enemy or no. Katsuki needed to know more about this guy. And so, upon returning to the table where his parents were getting ready to leave, Katsuki asked a question absolutely no one expected, least of all Deku, who turned to look at him with wide eyes and a gaping mouth. "Oi, auntie, can I spend the night here? Oi, auntie, can I spend the night here?" The entire room had gone completely silent, everyone just staring at the blonde in shock. Auntie was the first to breach the quiet, her face breaking out into an expression of pure elation. She was beaming so wide it looked like it hurt. "Yes. Of course you can stay the night, Katsuki." "Oh, this is so exciting, you haven't stayed over since you were both tiny." Auntie continued to babble on about how wonderful it all was, clapping excitedly every once in a while everyone else stood there gaping at Katsuki like fish out of water. The old hag was the next one to speak up, clearing her throat and blinking rapidly as if to disperse the surprise and confusion. "Yeah, I guess that's fine, if it's all right with Izuku," she said, directing her gaze toward the green-haired boy who'd been absently staring at Katsuki in bewilderment since the words left the blonde's mouth. The old hag's voice finally seemed to snap him out of it at least somewhat, though, making Deku tear his eyes away from Katsuki and focus on her instead. It took a moment longer for Deku to process what she'd said, and when he did, he simply nodded, slow and mechanic. Katsuki felt his eyebrow twitch. What the F was wrong with the demon nerd? He was acting like he'd just been told he just died or some shit. The blonde supposed it didn't really matter, though, because the nerd had said yes anyway. He'd be staying the night. Oh God! Izuku groaned, face buried in his palms. Kacchan is staying the night. Izuku was in the bathroom, leaning on the counter with his head in his hands. He'd retreated to its safety the second he'd gotten his bearings, needing some time to process whatever the hell just happened. Why? He mumbled softly to himself, pushing up from the counter and bracing himself against the wall instead. Why would Kacchan ask to spend the night? It doesn't make sense. He hates me. Maybe so he could spend time with Mom? No, that doesn't make sense. Kacchan doesn't like spending that much time around anyone, even people he likes. Maybe he's doing this to spite me somehow? He could be trying to make me uncomfortable, perhaps collect blackmail. No, he wouldn't go that far. Izuku rambled on, murmuring to himself all the possibilities. He probably sounded crazy to anyone that walked by, but he was too stuck in his head to care. Eventually, Izuku sagged against the wall, his brain having run out of steam from all the scenarios he thought up. No matter what he came up with, he just couldn't find an answer that was satisfying. He briefly thought that maybe he was growing on Kacchan, and that was why he'd wanted to stay, but he discarded that idea right away, throwing it in the metaphorical trash and burning it to a crisp with a metaphorical flamethrower. Even if it wasn't as far-fetched of an idea as it was, Izuku wouldn't have been able to make himself believe it, not with his father's words on loop, ringing in his head like a constant reminder that he was still a freak of nature. He tried not to let words like that affect him, tried to keep his head up high and lock the thoughts of self-hatred away as best as he could. He bottled everything up, thinking that maybe if he ignored it all it would eventually just go away. But it didn't. Instead, it just built up, putting the bottle under more and more pressure until eventually it started to crack and tear. It was only a matter of time before it exploded completely, but Izuku still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. Admitting that he wasn't okay felt like he was failing himself, somehow. It felt as though he was admitting defeat, allowing life to yank him down. He knew it was irrational, but in his head he wasn't drowning until he said he was. Izuku looked up at his reflection and was startled to see the beginnings of tears in his eyes, making his emerald irises shine. He wiped them away quickly, only to notice his hands had started shaking. His heart beat like a sledgehammer in his chest and his breath shuddered and stalled. The panic hadn't engulfed him yet, he could think clearly and his lungs continued to pull oxygen in diligently, but he could feel it lurking around the corner, ready to pounce on him any second. When he got like this, usually only one thing helped. Izuku opened the cabinet doors below the sink and peered inside, eyes searching for the familiar black box that should be behind the main pipe. Then, Izuku's heart rate skyrocketed, a brief memory flashing behind his eyes. Once his arms were cleaned and bandaged, he'd slid the kit under his bed and tucked the razor back into its box. He then sat the razor on his bedside table, too tired to put it back in its place in the bathroom. I'll just put it back in the morning, he told himself. Oh God. He'd never put it back. A different kind of panic overtook Izuku as he sprung to his feet and ran out of the bathroom. He had to put that box up before somebody found it, before Kacchan found it. The blonde had no sense of privacy when it came to Izuku. He'd look at whatever he found interesting whether the greenette wanted him to or not. Izuku reached his room only to find the door had already been opened and his heart stopped. He neared the open entrance and pushed it open further, a lump in his throat. There, sitting on the carpeted floor of Izuku's room, with a black box crumpled in his hand and an array of shiny metal razor blades laid out before him, was one red-eyed, volatile blonde. Abruptly, all of the fear, shame, and sadness drained out of him, leaving the green-haired boy pale and frozen as his mind tried to catch up with the situation. Izuku gulped. What happened now? Katsuki stared down at the contents of the dark little box he'd just opened, strewn out around him on the carpeted floor. He was alone, having walked into the room and looked around to entertain himself since Hisashi had left to go to the bar, apparently, and Deku was taking forever in the bathroom. He'd spotted the black box on the nerd's bedside table, looking so out of place among all his other colorful things, and grabbed it up intending to take a peek inside and then move on to something else when he inevitably found some meaningless nerdy sheet in there. That, however, was not what happened. Instead, all he saw upon opening that box was his own reflection, staring back up at him from small metal surfaces. He'd sat down and dumped them on the floor immediately, just to make sure that they really were what he thought they were. He'd stared down then at the collection, trying to make sense of it all. It didn't take long. He wasn't an idiot. He knew what this meant, knew what those razors were most likely used for. The hand holding the offending box squeezed shut as the information sunk in, unintentionally crushing the DMN thing. He didn't know how long he sat there for, staring at the slivers of metal absently, envisioning the nerd using them, pressing them into his flesh purposefully, before the bedroom door swung wide open. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The nerd had probably realized his mistake and had come running, but it was too late. Katsuki saw, and he'd never be able to unsee. Slowly, the blonde got to his feet, unfamiliar feelings roiling through him at light speed. He couldn't believe the ever-optimistic, determined and kind Deku would ever do this to himself. He was also aware, on some level, that this was at least partly his fault. Katsuki felt heavy. He felt angry, though he couldn't place why. "Show me your effing arms, Deku." Katsuki spoke, twisting where he stood to stare the green-haired boy in the eyes. Deku appeared frozen in place, his freckled hands still glued to the doorknob, his green eyes stuck to the ground where Katsuki had been, where the evidence of his struggles laid. "Deku!" Katsuki reiterated, voice no louder but filled with a warning. It did the trick, snapping Deku out of his daze in a flash. The timid boy stepped inside hesitantly and closed the door behind him, a look of pure dread hanging over his features. The blonde walked over to him, closing the distance because Deku obviously wasn't going to do it himself. He grabbed onto the smaller boy's wrist gently, gentler than he'd touched the greenette in a long time, and glanced up into shame-filled irises. "Show me, Deku." Deku's Adam's apple bobbed in his throat as he swallowed thickly, a shaky hand coming up to grip the sleeve just below Katsuki's hand. Deku's eyes flicked upward, locking onto Katsuki's for a split second before falling back to the cloth clutched between his fingers. Gradually, he pulled the sleeve back, revealing pale, marred skin. Lines of split flesh littered the greenette's forearm. Some were old, just long, white raised bumps. Others were newer, pink and obviously having scabbed over only recently. Katsuki's hand gripped Deku's wrist tighter instinctively and his red irises stayed fixed on the other's arm, the sight temporarily completely overwhelming the blonde. No wonder the freckled boy had reacted so harshly at the convenience store. Hot, burning tears erupted from Katsuki's eyes, leaving scorching trails along his cheeks as they descended. Katsuki gasped at the alien sensation. He hadn't cried since he was a little kid. The blonde finally let go of Deku's wrist and instead dug the heel of his palm into his eyes to stop the teardrops still threatening to spill. "Kacchan? Are you okay? Why are you cry-eyed dash? Shut up." The blonde cried out, rubbing his face roughly in an attempt to get rid of any leftover evidence. "I was only crying because dash." Katsuki paused, floundering briefly for a response. Somewhere inside, he was aware of the reason. It had been poking and prodding at him since the first time he'd noticed Deku's exhaustion. It was just beneath the surface, waiting to break free, but he still just wasn't quite ready to admit it yet. Close, but not there. "Because this is my fault. This is my guilt, and also my failure. That's why." It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. It didn't satisfy Katsuki, but it was evidently enough for Deku, who frowned at Katsuki and shook his head wildly. "No. Kacchan, this isn't your fault. I made the decision to do this myself." The blonde clicked his tongue. "Yeah, but would you have done that to yourself if I hadn't have treated you the way I did?" The greenette stalled at that, opening his mouth to speak but ultimately just closing it again, averting his eyes guiltily. Katsuki clenched his fists tightly, having been hoping for a different response despite knowing this was what it would be. "You helped, but you weren't the cause, Kacchan. I think I probably kept it up because of you, but I didn't start because of you. Deku said quietly, startling the blonde slightly. So it's not completely your fault. You shouldn't take the blame. The green-haired boy stated earnestly, looking at Katsuki with nothing but sincerity. Although he still felt guilty about helping the nerd's horrible habit persist, he also felt relieved at the words, knowing he wasn't the one to start it. If Katsuki didn't, though, who did? As far as he knew, no one treated Deku worse than Katsuki himself. Then why the F did you start? Katsuki asked after a brief moment. Who the F caused you so much pain that you do that to your own FNG arm? All the shitheads at school just follow my lead, none of them would do something worse than I have. Deku shuffled uncomfortably where he stood, dropping his eyes back to his feet. It's kind of a long story. And it's hard for me to talk about. The greenette said quietly, bowing his head and letting his curls obscure the majority of his face. Katsuki clicked his tongue and walked over to Deku's bed, sitting down on the edge and patting the spot next to him. Deku took the hint and made his way over to sit next to the blonde. Deku, I just found out you've been mutilating yourself for God knows how effing long. I think I should get to know why. Deku still looked unconvinced. Katsuki sighed and turned to face him more head-on. Look, Deku, I'm not gonna try and use this against you or laugh in your face or any of the shit you're probably thinking right now, alright? Just tell me. Deku studied him for a second, green eyes hesitant and calculating. Promise. Katsuki rolled his eyes, but said with complete seriousness anyway, promise, nerd. Deku's shoulders slumped at that and the boy let out a long sigh. Okay, I'll tell you if you really want to know, but it isn't exactly a fun story, the green-haired boy relented. Katsuki grunted his acknowledgement and got comfortable on the bed as Deku took a deep breath in, preparing to reveal his history. Izuku sat comfortably against his mother's chest, watching as All Might struck down yet another bad guy. He was so cool. He's so cool. He voiced aloud, glancing up between his parents to confirm that they, too, thought he was cool. They both smiled and nodded in agreement, Hisashi's hand coming down to settle lazily on top of Izuku's soft mop of unruly curls. Of course he's cool, Zuku. He has to be cool if you like him, the man said sweetly, earning a giggle from Inko and a cheer from Izuku. Izuku grinned widely, pleased, and cuddled further into his mother's chest. They stayed like that for a while, all curled up together on the couch as they watched heroes and villains battle it out on the other side of the screen. Before long, however, his mother was kissing his forehead and shifting him off her lap so she could get started on dinner. Izuku swiveled his head around to face Hisashi, who picked him up by the sides when Izuku made grabby hands. The man continued to hold him, digging his digits into Izuku's sides slightly, making the little Izuku burst into loud giggles and squirm fiercely in an attempt to free himself from the powerful fingers. Daddy! Tickles! The small boy screeched in complaint, patting at the large hands weakly with the flat of his palms. Tickles? You want tickles? Hisashi asked, smile bright and teasing. Izuku gasped and shook his head violently, fluffy curls tangling further with the movement. No! He yelled, no tickle. The 3-year-old toddler was cut off as Hisashi's fingers moved relentlessly against his sides. Izuku squealed loudly and kicked out his tiny feet, but they missed his father by a mile. Hisashi laughed heartily at the reaction and continued the good-natured assault for a minute, watching as Izuku's freckles were gradually buried beneath a healthy pink, before he finally relented and set his son down on his tiny feet. Izuku wiped away the tears that had begun forming at the corners of his eyes with chubby little fists, a happy, goofy little smile pinned on his face. So mean, Daddy! Izuku shouted, playfully indignant. Ah, but you love me anyway, don't you, Zuku? Hisashi pulled the little boy gently into his lap, grabbing a nearby brush and combing out the knots in his shamrock green hair with practiced ease. Izuku hummed, pressing his index finger to his pouting lips in contemplation. Hisashi ceased in his ministrations, pulling back slightly to give Izuku the best-kicked puppy look he could muster. Izuku's mirthful expression was quickly replaced by one of concern and guilt, his lower lip jutting out in a real pout. Daddy, no. Don't be sad. I was just joking. Izuku rushed to reassure him, jumping restlessly in his lap. I love you, Daddy, always. You know that. The little boy said before wrapping his small arms around his father the best he could and pressing a chubby, freckled cheek to the other man's chest. Hisashi chuckled again, softly, and cradled the back of Izuku's small head in his hand. I'll love you too, Izuku, no matter what. Always. Izuku felt his heart crack when the doctor told him. Felt it stutter in his chest when he was told to give up on his dream, the realization that no, he really couldn't be like All Might looming ominously over him. But it was okay, it would be alright because he still had his mommy and daddy who loved him very, very much and they would help him get through this. He was sure of it. Another little crack wedged itself into Izuku's beating heart when they got home that day and his mother told Hisashi what the doctor said. Izuku had looked up at him, hopeful and expectant. He stood waiting for the soft coos of sympathy that were sure to follow such news, the warm arms that would hold him close and protect him from the cruelness of the world. But Hisashi didn't even look at him. The man didn't say a word. He simply stared down at his coffee mug, steam still rising steadily from the rim, before standing, turning on his heel, and leaving the room as if nothing had been said. Izuku gripped the fabric of his shirt between the chubby fingers of his free hand, a habit that would persist throughout the years, and called out to him. Daddy, wait. He stared pleadingly at the empty space before him and tugged on his mother, whose hand was wrapped firmly around his own. Mommy, let me go. I have to go get Daddy. He didn't notice the way his mother's eyes glossed over with unshed tears, too focused on the hallway his father had disappeared down. I wanna dash, the little boy hiccuped. Inko knelt down then and cupped a pudgy cheek, gently encouraging those big, innocent eyes to train on her instead. They did, Izuku's bright emerald irises shining with uncertainty, hurt, and betrayal. Mommy, he started, his small voice so impossibly fragile, Daddy still loves me, right? The tears brimming Inko's lashes poured down her cheeks, her heart lurching for her son in a way it never could for herself, and she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around the child she loved so dearly. Oh, Izuku, of course. We could never stop loving you, she told him. Izuku clung to her desperately, trying his hardest to fight back the tears. She was right. His mama was always right. Daddy still loved him. He had to. Hisashi refused to even glance his way. Inko assured him it would pass, pet his head and told him a parent couldn't just stop loving their child, no matter what. Izuku didn't really believe her, but he held onto those words with everything he had, kept them close and played them on repeat in his head when sleep wouldn't come. But things only got worse. The man he adored with all his heart wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't touch him. It was like he wasn't even there, as if he simply ceased to exist. Despite the warmth his mother radiated, Izuku felt cold. Somewhere along the line, Mommy's reassurances changed from, "Of course he loves you, sweetie, I promise. It's just a phase," to, "You know I love you, my little Izuku. I'll love you no matter what. Always." How was she supposed to know those were the same words his father once murmured to him? She didn't, and so she kept saying them, and every time, Izuku could feel his expectations for life crumbling away, becoming nothing more than a child's daydreams. Izuku was sinking. He was being torn open at the seams, pulled apart and broken by not only his very nature, not only the peers and teachers who he once thought of as friends, but by the one person who was meant to hold him together. If his own father couldn't love him, how could anyone? How could he? Izuku's heart truly broke, for the first time, just days before his 5th birthday. Izuku watched, helplessly, as the blurry figure of his father walked towards the door, suitcase in hand. He could hear the sound of his mother's sobs from somewhere behind him, but he didn't have the courage to look back at her face. So he reached forward instead, small, tubby fingers grasping thin air desperately as the life he knew slipped out from underneath him. Distantly, he could hear himself sobbing, could feel the wetness of tear tracks making their way down his cheeks and tracing the corners of his lips. The TV was the only source of light in the room, the colors on screen flicking across the furniture and dancing along their flesh in rapid succession. He wasn't paying any attention to that, though. His focus was on the man he knew and trusted and loved walking out of the door, walking out of their lives forever. His father stilled in the doorway and turned halfway towards Izuku, the pretty colors spilling over his back and blanketing his front in darkness. Izuku smiled at the pause, crawling towards him on wobbly hands and knees, hope blooming in his chest like a hesitant flower. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he was staying after all. Maybe he realized he really did love Mommy and their little boy. Maybe he realized Izuku was worth it. "Don't come near me, Izuku." His father spoke, voice low and angry, and Izuku stopped. The hope that had so quickly sprouted in his chest wilted just as fast. It shriveled up inside him, leaving a frigid, empty space behind and a bitter taste on his tongue. "You're not my son," he growled out, his harsh voice so full of hatred. "You're nothing. You're useless and worthless and a complete waste of my time. You are a disappointment." He continued, spitting out the last word like poison, like the very sound of it rotted his eardrums. Izuku's eyes went wide, the room now silent. He could no longer hear his mother's desperate sobs. Couldn't hear his own deafening gasps for air, or the click of the door when his father finally left. All he could hear was the war of murmured thoughts and whispers filling his mind like a heavy cloud. "It's your fault. Quirkless. You failed him. Quirkless. You're a freak of nature. Quirkless. You're worthless and useless. Quirkless. You couldn't do anything. Quirkless. He's gone because you aren't enough. Quirkless. It's your fault." His heart rammed wildly against his ribcage and guilt swelled deep in his gut. It engulfed his young, frail body and kept him nailed to the spot as he hunched over, gulps for breath becoming heaves and soft cries crumbling into broken, choking sobs that threatened to spill the contents of his stomach, and ultimately, Izuku didn't know when his mother had picked him up and carried him to bed, whispering soft apologies and sweet promises into his ear. It felt like an eternity he'd spent laying on their living room floor, watching the colors of the TV paint blurry, nondescript scenes on the white wall. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't sleep very much at all after that, actually. And when he did, his dreams were full of tall men with dark curls, uttering words of disappointment and hatred not unlike the things others began to say, the things he began telling himself. Izuku never told his mother of his nightmares. He kept his mouth clamped shut when Kacchan asked what his parents thought of him being quirkless. He didn't tell his teachers why there were now only 2 stick figures in his drawings or explained why he stopped showing up to school with the special bento box his father had bought him. He stopped telling anybody anything after that. Deku's voice grew tremulous as he ended his story, his eyes filling with salty tears. "He taught me that I shouldn't love myself," the green-haired boy said, sounding choked as the tears squeezed their way out and dripped off his chin, making soft thuds on the bed and soaking into the comforter. "He was the first one to tell me I didn't matter, and because he's my father, I believed him." The greenette turned to him, then with an expression of pure heartbreak, and suddenly whatever dam Katsuki had built inside himself came crashing down. "I still do," Deku confessed, his voice strained and high-pitched as he struggled to stay coherent. Katsuki watched as Deku dissolved, then, sobs racking through the green-haired boy's body. His shoulders shook and his body trembled as brutal cries ripped themselves from his throat. He looked so small, so defeated. He curled into himself and his breath shuddered. Whatever he'd been feeling, hiding, pushing down, had exploded out and overtook him. Katsuki, unsure, reached out and hesitantly threaded shaking fingers through the other boy's hair, gentle and slow and so unlike the Katsuki the greenette was used to. Deku leaned into the touch and pressed himself against Katsuki, searching desperately for comfort. He looked up at him, fingers clenched in the material of Katsuki's sweatshirt and red-rimmed eyes spilling with torrent after torrent of unending tears. There were bags under his eyes and a pitiful lilt to his lips that screamed, "Please, help me." Katsuki's heart stuttered in his chest. He knew that the other boy hadn't been happy, even before he'd found out Deku's secret. He hadn't looked happy in a while. But he hadn't expected this, not even close. He'd assumed, stupidly, that the nerd was infallible when it came to things like this. To emotions and pain. It was one of the things he had despised about him. The fact that he could face any situation with a smile and come out on the other side later with nary a scratch had always irked Katsuki. The blonde had felt so inferior watching him. He hadn't realized it was a mask, a show, something Deku did and wore not only to trick the people around him but to convince himself. The Deku sitting in front of him was not the smiling child he had once known. He wasn't the one he'd beaten up on the playground when they were little, or even the one whose notebook he'd burnt and thrown out the window. This Deku was completely and utterly broken, an exhausted, overburdened version of his younger self. It couldn't have been easy to keep pushing forward, to continue to stay so positive and kind despite the way he had been so obviously shattered on the inside. Looking down at him then, thousands of memories replayed in his head. Images of a lonely child, tears streaming down his chubby freckled cheeks and disappearing into the corners of his wobbly smile as he offered his help to those who didn't deserve it. Visions of a scrawny young boy, trembling in his grasp and the smell of smoke filling the air, defending his dream as others laughed. He remembered the crack in his facade when Katsuki had told him to kill himself. When he'd asked who told him he could be a hero. When he'd yelled, shouted, screamed all of the things he so clearly hated about himself to his face every single day. All because he'd been scared and insecure. All at once, and a little too late, Katsuki realized he did care about Deku. He was forced to face the reality that he didn't really want to hurt the green-haired boy anymore. It was obvious to Katsuki, now, that the teen sitting in front of him never really did anything wrong. He'd never meant to upset Katsuki or make him feel inadequate. It wasn't Deku's fault Katsuki couldn't handle being anything less than perfection itself. Deku wasn't to blame when Katsuki looked at him and saw all the reasons he wasn't that. The boy with freckled cheeks, with a heart bigger than the sun itself and intentions of gold, was perfect in all the ways Katsuki couldn't be, and so Katsuki had tried to destroy him. Katsuki knew now he wasn't the only one. It seemed as though the world itself had tried its best to cripple Izuku Midoriya, and in some ways it had succeeded. Katsuki's gut twisted painfully, and this time, Katsuki recognized the feeling as true guilt, a pain brought about by wronging someone you cared for. He allowed himself to feel it, let it thrum through his veins with every beat of his heart. He wasn't really the sentimental or apologetic type, but he did always believe in punishment and consequences. This intense feeling of guilt and shame, this was his punishment. As for his consequences, well, he figured everything that came after this was a consequence. He knew he'd never really change, being an a-hole was just who he was, but every day would be a struggle to accept his own imperfections and dull the sharp edges of his harsh personality. Katsuki, by no means, was prepared to say any of that aloud, however. Just the thought of telling Deku that he was wrong, that he cared about him, felt like such a huge blow to his pride it made him feel sick. It was already dizzying just admitting it to himself. But that didn't mean he'd just sit around and do nothing. Katsuki Bakugos wasn't afraid of a mess. He'd helped create this, and he'd helped fix it. Katsuki wrapped his arms around the still shaking boy and allowed the other to crawl into his lap. He sat there for a long time, just holding the green-haired boy and letting him soak his sweatshirt with tears, slobber, and snot. He didn't complain once, not even when the nerd shoved his face in the crook of his neck and wet his skin too. At last, Deku's sobs quieted into sniffles and his ragged breaths smoothed out into long, even breaths. The greenette burrowed deeper into his large pink hoodie and scooted further into Katsuki's lap, seemingly content to cuddle up to the blonde whether he was crying or not. Get out of my lap if you're done crying, nerd. Katsuki told him when a minute passed and he still hadn't moved, though his voice was a little softer than usual. Deku startled and scrambled out of his lap, a blush on his face, but he didn't have that anguished expression any longer. Feel better, nerd? Katsuki asked, watching as Deku's lips twitched up into a small grin. Yeah, I really do. Thank you for comforting me, Kacchan. Even if it was only out of guilt for failing as a hero. Katsuki just nodded mutely, not bothering to correct the greenette. It wasn't that he didn't care to, he just couldn't bring himself to tell Deku the truth. At least not yet. Admitting to himself that he was wrong was one thing, but admitting he was wrong to someone else? Let alone Deku, who was the centerpiece in all his moral dilemmas and a significant part of his life. Yeah, no, not happening. Deku shifted on the bed, bringing his freckled hands into his lap and playing absently with the fabric of his shorts. "So what now?" he asked, peeking up at Katsuki shyly through long lashes. Katsuki fervently ignored the slight flutter of his stomach at the sight. He was not delving into whatever that meant right now, and instead lifted himself from the bed. "Well, for starters, we should go tell Auntie what you've been doing to yourself." Deku's eyes widened at that, the green-haired boy shooting off the bed and grabbing onto the blonde's arm with both hands in the span of a second. "Please don't," Deku squeaked, looking up at Katsuki imploringly. "Why not? I think your mother deserves to know what her son's been doing." Katsuki barked. "She's going through so much already, Kacchan. She's so stressed all the time, she doesn't need this on top of that." Deku's grip on his arm tightened. "Please, Kacchan. Please." Katsuki narrowed his eyes and stared down at the freckled boy's pleading face for a long while, mulling it over. "Fine," he conceded eventually, just when the nerd had started to become visibly nervous. At his answer, however, Deku positively lit up, and immediately there were 1,000 different "thank yous" and "I'm in your debt" spewing from the greenette's lips. But Katsuki interrupted Deku's spiel, making his face fall. "This dash," the blonde started, pointing towards Deku's arm, "can't keep happening. Talk to the school therapist instead or something. Hell, Katsuki might have to pay her a visit himself considering the amount of shit he had to think about after tonight. It wouldn't be the biggest hit he's had to take to his pride thus far. Besides, he'd made a promise to himself to be better, and as long as he was here admitting things to himself, he could confess he didn't really know where to start." Deku started, interrupting Katsuki's train of thought. The freckled boy bit his lower lip lightly, casting his gaze to the floor before speaking again. "I really can't. I'm busy all the time outside of school and I need all my time in school to study. I'll fall behind otherwise." Katsuki thought over the words for a minute before clearing his throat, his cheeks tinging pink slightly. "Well, maybe you can, just, if you feel like cutting, just text me, all right? We can talk about it. Or whatever." A brief moment of silence passed, where everything was completely still and neither of them said a thing. Then, tears were springing to Deku's eyes faster than Katsuki could blink, and suddenly the nerd was on him, hugging him tightly. Katsuki turned a vibrant shade of red and yelled, "Get off!" He pushed the greenette's face away, attempting to pry him off, but the guy was stronger than he looked. Funny, he didn't remember the nerd being this strong before. Once he finally managed to extract himself from the green-haired boy's clingy hold, he pushed the nerd onto the bed and walked over to where the razors were still splayed out on the floor. "Get some FNG sleep, nerd. I'll get rid of the razors." The blonde grumbled, crouching down to carefully gather the metal pieces and wrap them in a light blue handkerchief he kept in his pocket. Deku hummed his assent and Katsuki got up, razors in hand. "Well, in handkerchief." When Katsuki got back a few minutes later, there was a sleeping pad already made and laid out on the floor, next to the bed where Deku had apparently already fallen asleep. His breakdown must have tired him out. Katsuki huffed slightly and flicked off the light, patting his way over to the homemade bed quietly. As he settled under the blankets and closed his eyes, Katsuki whispered into the darkness, "Night, Deku." Getting up in the morning was easier that day than Izuku remembered it being in a long time. Kacchan had left before Izuku had even gotten up, presumably to get clothes and school supplies from his house before school. "I have to remember to thank him when I see him next," he thought, pulling on his black middle school uniform. It was because of Kacchan he'd slept so soundly, after all. The green-haired boy got ready for school with a smile on his face, appreciating the warmth from the sun's soft glow as it spilled in through the window and painted his room orange. He felt so light, he hadn't even realized just how heavy the burden he'd been carrying was until it was lifted from his shoulders. The freckled boy checked himself in the mirror, picking at and messing with his curls a little before giving up and grabbing his things. He skipped all the way to school and sat down at an unusually clean desk, prepared to absorb as much information as possible. The day was turning out to be a good one, and he wouldn't let it go to waste. And when Kacchan walked through the door, Izuku did thank him, to which the blonde responded with a low snarl of, "Shut the F up." So, essentially, exactly what Izuku had expected. Izuku had just smiled back at the angry boy, much to the latter's chagrin. The greenette managed to stay focused the entire day, the pages of his notebook filled with so much detail the words were beginning to get crammed in the corners. He was able to appreciate the view from the roof come lunchtime instead of just mindlessly shoveling his food into his mouth like usual, and smiling didn't feel so painful or forced. The air felt so crisp and everything looked so alive. It wasn't that he was euphoric, far from it. He just felt normal, and that wasn't something he'd had the privilege of feeling lately. To him, it was a luxury, and he cherished every second of it. Izuku was making his way out of school when a blue sneaker shoved its way into his path. The green-haired boy didn't have enough time to react and hit the foot, tumbling down to the ground before he could catch himself. His face hit the concrete hard and the taste of copper filled his mouth. The boys who tripped him snickered and made snide remarks as they walked away, sparing a glance back as Izuku got up but nothing more. And suddenly, Izuku's chipper mood came crashing down on his head. The weight came right back, and abruptly all the greenette wanted to do was lay down in bed and stop existing for a while. It was such a drastic shift in his frame of mind that he almost forgot he'd been feeling good at all. Izuku got up anyway, though, and continued on, a small spark of irritation igniting in his chest. It didn't make sense. He was bullied constantly, he was used to it, and the rest of the day had gone just fine. Such a small act shouldn't make him feel so miserable. What is wrong with me? He thought to himself. This isn't normal, is it? The teen sighed and shook his head. It was fine, the mood change was probably only temporary. Besides, he had things he had to do, whether he was in good spirits or not. And so Izuku worked just like normal, pushing himself past his limits with all might and then pushing himself even further at work, ignoring the signs his body kept sending him, begging him to stop. Nothing was different from any other day, and yet that misery never faded, and when Izuku closed up the shop that night, he felt so much more exhausted than usual. He thought he'd already hit the wall as far as that went, but apparently that particular hole was bottomless. He also realized, with moderate alarm, that he didn't really remember much of the day after he'd been tripped. In the moment, it had felt like time was crawling along at a snail's pace, every moment so excruciatingly clear. But now that it was all over with, and he was standing there with the daylight hours behind him, it seemed as though it had all gone in a blur. He tried harder to recall all of the events, but his thoughts were muddled and hazy, like they were buried beneath a layer of fog, and Izuku just didn't have the energy to sift through them. When Izuku's attention refocused on the world around him, he discovered he was in his room. Startled, Izuku pulled out his phone and checked the time, just to make sure he'd actually walked there and wasn't quirked there or something. Sure enough, the jump in time suggested he'd simply been operating on autopilot. The greenette plopped down on the edge of his bed and buried his face in his hands, not bothering to turn the light on. He needed to sleep, that much was clear, but despite how tired he felt, he knew sleep wouldn't come. He'd just end up laying there for who knows how long, staring at the wall and wishing, hoping, pleading for sleep to overtake him, but it wouldn't. Not for hours, at least. That's how it had been for a long time, especially recently, and he doubted tonight was any different. This is so unfair, his inner voice whispered pathetically. It isn't, but life isn't fair. You know this, and it's never held you back before. But this isn't something I can control. I can't do anything. I've never really been able to. My dream would have already been lost if not for All Might. He saw something in you, though, right? He chose you for a reason. You must be worth something. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. On my own, I'm useless. Worthless. I'm nobody. He could have easily chosen anyone else. I shouldn't think like this. But I'm just not sure I'll ever be good enough. Izuku's hands began to feel damp and the boy noticed he'd started crying. The greenette lifted his head a little, staring at his wet hands as tears made their way down his cheeks. He didn't know what to do. He wanted release, wanted to grab the little black box that used to sit underneath the sink, wanted to press the metal to his skin and feel the pain that reminded him whose life this was, who was in the driver's seat. He wrapped his arms around himself, his nails beginning to dig into his pale flesh. Then, Kacchan's words echoed in his head. Just, if you feel like cutting, just text me, all right? We can talk about it. Or whatever. Izuku released his arms and immediately reached for his phone, but paused when his hand hovered only millimeters above it. Should he text Kacchan? He was probably just saying that he doesn't really want to sit and hear me talk about my problems. But he did offer, maybe this could be a way for Kacchan and I to grow closer. I don't want to burden him, though. I don't want to burden him, but at the same time. Izuku sighed heavily and grabbed his phone, sending a text to Kacchan, collision, before he could change his mind. Hey, it's Izuku. Or Deku, I guess. You probably don't have my name saved in your phone. Anyway, you said the other day to text you when I feel like hurting myself, and I guess I kind of am right now. Sorry if this is annoying. No sooner than Izuku put down his phone did it ding back at him, alerting him Kacchan had replied. He quickly looked, half prepared to see an annoyed text telling him to shut up and go to sleep. Instead, all the other had said was, meet me at the park in 20. The park, huh? Izuku hadn't been there since he was a little kid, playing ball with the other little boys and laughing along with them until it inevitably became being laughed at. His memories of the place were very bittersweet. Izuku slipped on his shoes and pulled on a jacket haphazardly before slipping out of the house as quietly as possible. He descended the steps of his apartment complex and stepped out onto the sidewalk as he zipped his jacket up, making his way down the street and towards his childhood park. Everything was quiet and still, most people having already gone to bed. The sound of his shoes hitting the concrete sounded so loud in the silence. As soon as Izuku rounded the corner to enter the park, he spotted a hunched-over blonde, sitting on a swing, scrolling through his phone and bathing his ever-scowling face in white light. Izuku stopped to stare for a minute before he realized he was being pretty creepy and stepped into the park, his feet thudding against the dirt beneath his feet and alerting the other of his presence. Katsuki looked up at the sound of footsteps only to stare straight into nervous, green irises. The freckled boy was making his way over to him slowly, playing with the hems of his sleeves anxiously. Katsuki locked his phone and slid it into his back pocket as he leaned on the chain of the leather swing he was sat in. Deku stopped a couple feet away from him, still obviously unsure. The blonde just rolled his eyes and slapped the seat of the swing next to him, sending pieces of chipped red paint fluttering to the soil beneath them. Hurry up and sit down, shitty nerd. I don't want to have to pick your butt up from the ground if you have another breakdown. Deku gulped but nodded, hesitantly taking a seat on the swing next to Katsuki. His hands gripped the chain tightly and his eyes stayed trained on the ground. Honestly, Katsuki had no idea what he was doing. He knew he wasn't the best with words, he wouldn't be able to offer any comfort, and there was no way Deku didn't know that. The school therapist, whom he'd gone to see at school earlier in the day, told him that sometimes all someone needed was a person willing to listen. He wasn't sure if that was really enough, but it's not like he knew of anything else to do. He could be honest with him and offer his advice, but he knew he'd probably just end up being too harsh and scaring the little sheet off. Plus, there were some things you just couldn't give advice for. He hadn't gone through the things Deku had and continued to. The blonde was confident about most things, having navigated the majority of obstacles in his life with an ease others envied, but there was always something about the nerd that had forever stumped him. When it came to those green curls and freckled cheeks, Katsuki usually found himself at a complete loss, and it seemed now was no exception. Speaking of green curls and freckled cheeks, Deku was still just staring at his stupid red sneakers and choking the metal chains to death. Katsuki huffed and, before he even really thought about it, clicked his tongue and said, "Just effing spit it out, already." The nerd flinched slightly, and the word, sheet, briefly flashed in Katsuki's mind, but then Deku was gathering his wits and taking a shaky breath. The timid boy finally broke the silence. "I think there's something wrong with me." Katsuki raised an eyebrow. He hadn't been expecting that. I don't really know how to explain it to you. It kind of like static. Like my head is just full of it. It's all I see, all I hear, all I feel. Deku's lips grew wobbly, a clear sign the tears weren't far behind. "I don't get it," Katsuki confessed. "What the hell does static mean?" Nothing that was coming out of the nerd's mouth made sense to him. He was feeling static? "Sorry," the other said, taking a moment to calm himself down and keep the waterworks at bay a little longer. "I guess I just feel miserable all the time. but it's not. A sad miserable. Well, it kind of is, just not really? Oh no, I'm not making any sense again. Deku looked pained, his face contorting in a flurry of emotions Katsuki couldn't decipher. Oi, calm down. You're not on a time limit, dipshit. Despite the coarseness of his words, they seemed to relax the greenette somewhat. His fingers went slack on the metal links still in his grasp and his expression softened. The green-haired boy sat there for a while, just regulating his breathing and focusing intensely on something Katsuki couldn't see or hear. The blonde waited patiently as someone like him could, at any rate, kicking the dirt until Deku was ready to talk again. Finally, the green-haired boy turned to meet Katsuki's stare, a forlorn, conflicted look adorning his features. I hate waking up in the mornings, he started, his voice soft and 1,000 times calmer than what it had been. And I know everyone hates waking up in the mornings, but I really hate it. I hate going to sleep at night because I dread waking up the next morning. Though sleep never comes easy for me anyway, and when it does, I get nightmare after nightmare. And I'm tired all the time. And yes, I don't get good sleep and I work a lot. It's perfectly reasonable I'd be tired all the time, but it's more than that. It's like, you know that kind of tired you get after a really long, arduous test and you just don't want to do anything for a while? It's like that, but constantly. I can't escape it. It's always there, weighing me down. Even doing small things is so stressful. It feels impossible thinking about all the things I have to do every day. I just want to scream at the top of my lungs and make it all go away. To make it worse, I can't stop hating myself. I don't want to. I've been trying for so long to love myself. I keep my head up no matter what happens. I keep trying and working and lying to myself. I tell myself all these things I don't believe in the hopes that it'll eventually start to feel more true, but it never does. Why doesn't it, Kacchan? Why do I feel so heavy and sad and numb all the time? Why do I feel so guilty just for existing? Why is it that the littlest things can ruin my day? Why am I starting to feel so hopeless? What's wrong with me? The green-haired boy's voice cracked at the end, the tears he'd managed to keep suppressed all that time finally beginning to drip down his face. They poured down his face in all directions, wetting the corners of his nose, gliding over freckles and curving down the underside of his jaw, falling from his chin and splattering on the faded, red leather seat of the rusty old swing. The light from a nearby lamppost provided just enough glow to see, framing the greenette's anguish in a way that shouldn't have been as pretty as it was. Belatedly, Katsuki realized Deku was waiting for an answer. I don't know. Katsuki told him honestly, too taken aback to be embarrassed by that fact. He'd thought the nerd's previous breakdown would be as bad as it got, but apparently he was wrong. This situation wasn't nearly as panicky or outwardly severe, but it was heavier. What Deku had just described to him, it was something Katsuki had never known, had never even been around. Once again, Katsuki found himself floundering, searching what was supposed to be his endless knowledge, for some kind of idea, some direction as to what to say or do next. But he found nothing. Deku always had a way of exposing all of Katsuki's doubts, all his inadequacies and gaps in the guise of supremacy he always held up. Just the sight of the greenette had always incited emotions that made the blonde feel so uncertain, and it scared Katsuki. But despite the way his brain was telling him to push the other away, to get rid of the problem and run away from himself, he wouldn't. Anyone with a soul would say Deku's problems were more important than Katsuki's self-pity right now, and despite what a lot of people thought, Katsuki did have a soul. A very rough, hardened, and spiky soul. So the red-eyed boy leaned forward and dug his fingers into Deku's hair. And then dunked his head down, folding the other boy in half. Deku squeaked, but made no attempt to remove Katsuki's hand. The idiot. We'll figure it out, alright? What all do you gotta do tomorrow? Deku, who was looking up at Katsuki as best he could from under his hand, stuttered, well, tomorrow's really busy for me. Actually, every day is busy for me, but my afternoon on Friday is free, the greenette offered, an apologetic and sheepish look on his face. Katsuki frowned a bit but nodded, finally releasing the nerd's head and letting him sit up properly again. Alright, Come over to my house after school on Friday, then. We'll research it. Deku's eyes blew wide, and, unsurprisingly, flushed a light pink, a beaming smile splitting his face. Don't effing make that face at me, Katsuki sneered, but Deku only giggled a little in response. Deku was getting less fearful around Katsuki since his breakdown, and the blonde didn't know how to feel about that. It was probably a good thing, he knew that, but that didn't mean the little sheik got to be a snarky little a-hole. Katsuki flicked his nose and made him whine instead. Don't let the sheik go to your head. You're not a special snowflake, a-hole. I know, Kacchan, I know, Deku said, a small grin on his face. Katsuki clicked his tongue but left it at that, opting to change topics. So did this, Katsuki gestured vaguely between them, help at all? The green-haired boy looked contemplative for a moment, then, and Katsuki felt his heart squeeze a little in apprehension. Yeah, I think it did. I feel a little better. The greenette said eventually. Katsuki felt himself relax and hummed in reply, already getting up from the swing. Good, I guess. I'm gonna go home. You should too. I'll see you tomorrow, Kacchan, Deku said, rising from his seat as well. Katsuki turned around and headed off, then, not bothering to return the wave the greenette was most definitely sending his way. As Katsuki dragged himself all the way home, tired as hell after being woken up, he thought about what the green-haired boy had told him. He wasn't really sure if something was wrong with him, but what he'd described sure as hell didn't sound normal. Most people didn't have trouble sleeping, feel horrible all the time, hate and hurt themselves, or get feelings of hopelessness. Just how long had the nerd been feeling this way? What did it mean that he felt that way? Was it a result of all the bullying? Is this my fault?